Hearing will come to order. Let me first of all welcome to our witnesses and to members of the public and the press. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. Today's hearing takes place just a few weeks from the 70th anniversary of the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known as NATO. There are many pressing issues facing NATO today, but for us to really assess where the alliance stands in the year 2019, we need to take a step back and look at the history of this great political and military relationship. The first half of the 20th century was marked by periods of widespread suffering, instability, and fear. And at the start of both world wars, the United States stayed out of the fray, grateful that the Atlantic Ocean kept us far away from the terrors in Europe and the rest of the world. By putting our heads in the sand and trying to stay away from the conflicts, those wars grew into direct threats to our own economy, security, and very way of life, not to mention the immense suffering that happened while we waited on the sidelines, including the unprecedented horror of the Holocaust. So after World War II, American leaders understood that it was in our strategic interest and also a moral obligation to band together with countries that shared our commitment to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. We joined with European democracies to form NATO, an organization built on the principle that we are stronger when we stand together. Now, 70 years later, NATO is widely recognized as the most successful political military alliance in history. Its achievements include facing down Soviet communism and winning the Cold War, advancing freedom and democracy in Europe, stopping genocide and bringing peace to the Balkans, and fighting the international threat of terrorism. And in the United States, across the decades, our transatlantic partnership has consistently won overwhelming bipartisan support. But a few years ago, things started to change, since before he even came into office, President Trump has taken opportunities to denigrate our allies and undermine NATO in his personal dealings with European leaders, his policy proposals, and the rhetoric. I witnessed that personally when I attended the Munich Security Conference last month and heard from leader after European leader that America's word, the security guarantee underpinning the transatlantic alliance, is now being questioned. President Trump often depicts the NATO partnership as some kind of one-way street where the United States bears inordinate costs with little benefit, and that's just not true. Our European partners have contributed immensely to our shared missions, and they've come to America's defense when we were most in need. After September 11, 2001, our allies stood with us, the only time, I might say, in NATO's history that Article 5, the principle that an attack on one is an attack on all, has been invoked. And in recent years, European, Canadian, and American troops have fought bravely together side by side to defend the national security of all allies. One of President Trump's most frequent criticisms is that allies habitually free ride and that allies hosting American military forces don't pay the United States enough money. Earlier this week, we learned about his latest proposal to address this concern, a so-called Cost Plus 50 plan. In this system, allies would pay the full cost of stationing American troops on their territory, plus an outlandish additional 50%. This whole scheme reveals just how little the President seems to understand about the way our alliances advance our own strategic interests. When we base troops in a NATO country, we aren't just providing that nation with free security. Our presence strengthens the alliance's position in Europe and extends America's strategic reach. And our alliances, especially NATO, directly benefit the United States by enhancing our military power, global influence, economic might, and diplomatic leverage. That's not to say I expect our allies to not provide any financial contribution at all. NATO countries have already agreed to pay 2% of their GDP on defense by the year 2024, and I agree with President Trump when he said that they should fulfill that obligation. We should hold them to that obligation, but the conversation should be more than only financial burden sharing. Instead, we need to see the big picture of how our allies contribute to our collective goals. But the President's constant denigration of our allies presents a real threat to our foreign policy and national security objectives, and frankly, it's just baffling. President Trump is much more critical of our European allies, societies that share our commitment to core values, than he is of brutal dictators such as North Korea's Kim Jong-un or Russia's Vladimir Putin. And that's why it's so important that we in Congress take a leadership role on this front. I'm pleased that in this body, support for our European allies and partners continues to be bipartisan. You can see that in a resolution that the ranking member and I are introducing that would reaffirm the House's support for America's alliances and partnerships around the world. Simply put, NATO is one of our most precious geopolitical assets and should stay that way. It's important that we stand together to send this message because the NATO alliance is needed now as much as ever before. We are seeing a rise in authoritarianism, continued threats from international terrorism and extremism, and aggressive attempts by Putin to invade Russia's neighbors and attack democratic elections throughout the world. It's by working with our NATO allies, standing side by side, that we can successfully face these challenges head on. So it's critical that we have a full understanding of the current state of the alliance. We need to explore the role that NATO plays in America's foreign policy and discuss ways we can improve the organization, including efforts to make sure our allies follow through on all their obligations. I'm eager to hear from our witnesses about these issues, but first, I'll recognize our ranking member, Mr. McCall of Texas, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was created on April the 4th, 1949. This was a historic moment. At that time, the international community was still recovering from the most devastating conflict the world has ever seen. Born out of the chaos of World War II, my father's war, NATO was formed to protect European democracies against Soviet totalitarianism and prevent a third world war. 70 years later, the greatest military alliance ever created has proven that the free peoples of the world are the strongest when we stand together. From that confrontation with communism during the Cold War to the defeat of Milosevic in Kosovo to the battlefields of Afghanistan, American soldiers and those of our NATO allies have fought and bled together. In fact, the only time that Article 5, as the chairman said, has ever been invoked was after 9/11 terror attacks. This collective defense agreement and the acknowledgement that an attack on one is an attack on all is a cornerstone of the alliance, and we must keep it that way. NATO has enhanced our military capability, increased our intelligence collection, and created a bulwark against international terror. It is critical to our national security and solidifies our friendships with member states. NATO continues to grow as countries in Europe meet important objectives. And as I was pleased to see that North Macedonia will be joining the alliance as its newest member. However, friends must also be honest with each other. Some of our allies have not been living up to the decision at the Wales Summit in 2014 to spend 2% of their GDP on national defense. Thankfully, under pressure from the administration, member countries have begun to spend more. NATO Secretary General recently announced that by the end of next year, an additional $100 billion will be contributed by our European partners. This is bad news for Vladimir Putin, but good news for the future of NATO's common defense. And over the next 70 years, we will be challenged again and again. We've already seen a resurgent Russia attack its neighbors, from cyber attacks in Eastern Europe to military conflicts in Georgia and Ukraine. It is clear that Putin wants to reclaim the superpower status of the Soviet Union. We can meet our challenges if they are confronted with unity and strength. Division and weakness will only tear us apart. Each of today's witnesses have served our country well, and I know all of you personally. You've developed an expertise on foreign policy and national security affairs. I look forward to having a thoughtful and bipartisan discussion and hearing on their thoughts on how to maintain a strong and effective NATO. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. It's now my pleasure to introduce our witnesses. Michelle Flournoy is co-founder and managing partner of West Exec Advisors and a former co-founder and CEO of the Center for New American Security. She previously served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and co-led on President Obama's transition team at the Department of Defense. Ambassador Douglas Lute is a senior fellow with the Project on Europe and the Transatlantic Relationship at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. He was formerly the United States Permanent Representative to the North Atlantic Council, NATO standing political body. He also previously served as Deputy Director of Operations for United States European Command. Derek Chollet is the Executive Vice President of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. He was formerly Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, where he managed U.S. defense policy toward Europe and NATO, the Middle East, Africa, and the Western Hemisphere. Previously, he was Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Strategic Planning on the National Security Council staff. Finally, Ian Brzezinski is a resident senior fellow with Transatlantic Security Initiative in the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. He was previously the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO Policy. He also served as a senior professional staff member on the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. We won't hold that against you, Mr. Brzezinski. Implementing legislative initiatives and strategic strategies concerning U.S. interests in Europe, Russia, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. We're grateful to all of your service and your time this morning. You can see it's a very prominent panel that we have. Our witnesses' testimony will be included in the record of this hearing, and I'd like to now recognize our witnesses for 5 minutes each. Let's start with Ms. Flournoy.
Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, distinguished members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify this morning about the importance of NATO and our alliances more broadly for U.S. national security. At the end of World War II, the United States had a remarkable foresight to establish a set of alliances in Europe and Asia as a means of protecting and advancing U.S. interests and also as pillars of a new rules-based international order. These alliances have underwritten 70 years of unprecedented prosperity, economic growth, security, and stability. They are without precedent in history, and they are of great strategic value to the United States and the American people. Our NATO alliance, as well as our bilateral alliances in Asia, provide the United States with enormous strategic advantages. Our allies are our most reliable partners in confronting a host of shared challenges, from proliferation to climate change, challenges that no single nation, no matter how powerful, can address alone. Our allies tend to be our closest trading partners. Look at the U.S. and Europe, with more than $1 trillion in trade every year. Our allies contribute to U.S. national security as our closest military partners, going into harm's way shoulder to shoulder with American troops, providing essential basing and support to military operations overseas, enhancing the familiarity of U.S. forces with their operating theaters, overseas theaters of operation, and cementing military-to-military relationships that are the human foundation for interoperability and effectiveness in coalition operations. Perhaps most importantly, these allies help us underwrite deterrence, prevent conflict, and address persistent threats like terrorism. Our allies can also be incredibly powerful partners in advancing our shared values, our commitment to democracy and human rights. Our transatlantic alliance is particularly valuable. Over its 70-year history, NATO has provided a number of strategic benefits to the U.S. that are frankly too often forgotten in today's political discourse. Thanks to NATO, we were able to contain the Soviet Union, prevent the spread of communism, deter a potentially nuclear confrontation, and ultimately win the Cold War. Thanks to NATO, when the Berlin Wall fell, we were able to create a Europe whole, free, and at peace. Thanks to NATO, we were able to conduct military operations that helped end the war in Bosnia and enforce a negotiated peace. Thanks to NATO, America was not alone in fighting al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and globally. NATO, as was noted, invoked Article 5 for the first time in its history on our behalf after 9/11. Our NATO allies sent and sustained a rotational force of some 40,000 troops in Afghanistan fighting alongside us. They took a lead in providing stability and security in the north and saved the U.S. an estimated $49 billion in the process. They have contributed $2.3 billion to the support of the Afghan National Army. They are still with us today with 17,000 troops in resolute support, providing training and support to Afghan forces now leading the fight. Most importantly, we should never forget that more than 1,000 non-U.S. NATO troops lost their lives in Afghanistan, making the ultimate sacrifice. Today, our NATO allies remain among our most critical partners in dealing with 21st century challenges. Many of our NATO allies are our closest partners fighting terrorism globally. Think France in the Maghreb, or the UK in Iraq and Syria. In Iraq, NATO has provided 350 trainers, AWACS aircraft for surveillance, and so forth. The European allies have also been among our closest partners in combating nuclear proliferation. After Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and the invasion of eastern Ukraine, it was our European allies who stood up and helped us impose the harshest sanctions against Russia in history. And they have borne the brunt of the costs. More than 90% of the costs of those sanctions have been borne by Europeans, including the loss of hundreds of thousands of export-related jobs across Europe. NATO has also stepped up to strengthen deterrence vis-a-vis Russia, particularly in the Baltics, Poland, and the frontline states, with the enhanced forward presence involving 4,500 NATO troops and in initiatives to enhance NATO readiness. They've stepped up to prepare for cyber attacks, other shared missions like counter-piracy, humanitarian relief, and so forth. So my point is there are many other factors besides just measuring defense spending to assess that we have to weigh in assessing the value of these alliances. We should implore our NATO allies to spend more on defense, but that should not be the only metric of our burden sharing, especially given their shared sacrifice. That would be disrespectful, short-sighted, and wrong. I think given our allies' track record of invaluable contributions, the President's persistent disparagement of NATO and our partners there, our allies there, constitutes foreign policy malpractice and undermines our U.S. interests. Most disturbingly, the continued bad-mouthing of our NATO allies has created uncertainty in the mind of our closest partners, has opened up a serious debate in Europe about whether the U.S. remains a credible partner and a reliable leader. So after 70 years of shared sacrifice and success, I think it's appalling that we're in this position today. We should be honoring and celebrating that 70 years of success. We must take stock of the many ways in which our allies have contributed to our security. Now is not a time to disparage or abandon or nickel and dime NATO. It is a time to double down on our shared and make the shared investments that are necessary to deal with an era of strategic competition. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Flournoy. Mr. Cholet.
Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. This year marks a pivotal moment for NATO, commemorating landmark anniversaries in the alliance's history, yet also confronting fundamental questions about its future. For an alliance forged in the rubble of the Second World War, NATO stands today as the most successful security partnership in history. I believe a strong NATO remains essential to advancing U.S. national security interests. It is an indispensable force multiplier for American power. If NATO did not exist today, we would be racing to invent it. Yet at a time of significant turbulence at home and abroad, many are asking about whether the U.S. still believes in NATO. They watch our debates or read our Twitter feeds and wonder how committed the U.S. remains. That's why Congress is essential to affirming and bolstering U.S. leadership in NATO. Now, taking stock of the alliance today, one could easily depict things only in dire terms, focusing on discord and disagreement. Yet the alliance is also exhibiting renewed energy. This can be measured in at least 4 ways. First, in the area of territorial defense, where member states are stepping up deployments, adapting to evolving threats, and spending more on their militaries. Second, in the alliance's commitment to some of its basic principles, such as the open door policy, bringing new members into the organization. Third, this renewed energy can be measured by public opinion, where support for NATO remains very high throughout Europe, and particularly in the United States. And fourth, it can be seen in NATO's enduring commitment to common security, especially in places like Afghanistan. For these reasons, NATO continues to show that it is a unique asset to the United States. However, NATO faces no shortage of challenges. These include threats from rival powers, especially Russia's efforts to test, divide, and weaken the alliance, as well as China's rising military threat, which is getting greater attention among our European partners. These include such challenges as cyber threats and hybrid warfare, enduring challenges along NATO's southern flank, where state failure, violent extremism, and refugee flows pose the primary threats. And finally, there are internal tensions that undermine alliance unity. This last challenge is perhaps the most worrying. NATO faces a growing crisis within its ranks. NATO is about much more than armaments and military capabilities. It is an alliance rooted in common values. The preamble of the 1949 Washington Treaty stipulates that the alliance was founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. Yet democratic backsliding and nationalist politics are on the rise in too many places. This makes it harder to maintain allied unity. It raises questions about common commitment to NATO's future. Across European capitals and here in Washington, too many are wondering whether the U.S. would fulfill its commitment to collective defense. For this reason, Congress has an especially urgent and important role to play in maintaining U.S. leadership in NATO. Continued support for funding of the U.S. military and diplomatic efforts in Europe will remain essential. So will the continued willingness of so many members of Congress to travel to NATO headquarters and other European capitals to show support for the alliance and press for its continued reforms. And your legislative efforts, such as the recent passage of the Bipartisan NATO Support Act, are indispensable. We must rekindle the spirit that helped energize U.S. leadership in NATO in the first place, and also recall that sustaining this leadership over decades has never been easy. We would be wise to remember history's lessons. Allow me to conclude on one of them. Exactly 68 years ago, a similar debate about NATO gripped Washington and specifically the U.S. Congress. Back then, many major political figures doubted the wisdom of NATO, claiming that deploying American troops to Europe was not in the nation's best interest. It fell to General Dwight Eisenhower, a year before he became president, to come out of retirement and galvanize American support to send troops to Europe. In February 1951, Eisenhower came here to Capitol Hill to make his case. Speaking before both houses of Congress, he passionately argued for what he called the enlightened self-interest of American leadership in NATO. Congress embraced Ike's call to action. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McCall, members of the committee, at a moment when we hear echoes of the same doubts about NATO's value to U.S. national interests, we would be well served to recall Eisenhower's wisdom. And as we approach NATO's 70th anniversary this spring, we must again look to Congress to embrace this mission as it did 7 decades ago. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cholet. Mr. Lute.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for bringing us together today to discuss the NATO alliance, a cornerstone of American national security policy for the last 70 years, but a cornerstone that I think we all too often take for granted. The topic of today's session is NATO at 70, an indispensable alliance. Coincidentally, just last month, Harvard University's Belfer Center published a report that I co-authored with Ambassador Nick Burns, and the title of our report was NATO at 70, an alliance in crisis. So as NATO approaches its 70th anniversary in just a few days, both descriptions strike me as accurate. NATO is both indispensable and in crisis. Our report outlines 10 major challenges facing the alliance. These challenges are diverse, complex, and happening simultaneously. That's why we conclude that the alliance is in crisis. The report identifies 4 challenges from within the alliance, and others have already mentioned some of these. First, reviving American leadership of the alliance, restoring European defense strength, that is, defense spending, upholding NATO's democratic values, and streamlining NATO decision-making. Another 4 challenges come from beyond NATO's borders, containing Putin's Russia, ending the Afghan war, refocusing NATO's partnerships, and maintaining an open door to future members. Finally, the last 2 of the 10 challenges are challenges that loom on the horizon, winning the technology battle in the digital age and competing with China. I'd like to highlight just a couple points out of this report. I request that the full report be entered into the record. First, NATO's single greatest challenge today is, for the first time in NATO's history, the absence of strong, committed U.S. presidential leadership. Every previous president since 1949, both Democrats and Republicans, has understood the value of NATO. Most fundamentally, allies today are unsure of this president's commitment to the Article 5 collective defense commitment. This shakes the core of the alliance. Here, the United States Congress can play a role to reassure allies and check and balance the president, as the House did in January this year by approving the NATO Support Act. More specifically, on a bipartisan basis, Congress should reaffirm regularly the U.S. commitment to NATO, should continue to fund the European Defense Initiative, and should pass legislation requiring congressional approval should the President attempt to alter our treaty commitments or to leave the alliance altogether. Approval of the NATO treaty in 1949 required two-thirds majority in the Senate. The same should be required to leave the alliance. Second, Europeans must contribute more to their defense. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned this in your opening comments. I was the U.S. ambassador to NATO in 2014 when allies committed to the 2% pledge. It is an appropriate and necessary metric. Today, only 5 allies reach that level of defense spending. This administration is right to hold allies to the pledge. At the same time, however, 2% was never intended to be the only meaningful measure of an ally's contribution. So NATO should broaden its metrics. Most important, spending on capabilities to counter hybrid tactics, including cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and interference in our democratic processes, should be taken into account, as these may represent NATO's greatest vulnerability. Third, a challenge on the horizon. NATO needs to pay more attention to China's increasing influence in Europe. And I'll leave that for now, but in my view, in the coming decades, NATO's importance will only grow because of the U.S. competition with China. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I want to point out a false narrative that ignores the values and erodes the cohesion of NATO. This false narrative claims that NATO is an anachronism, outdated and obsolete, that our allies are ripping us off, taking advantage of our generosity. This is simply not true. The truth is that the U.S. created NATO and has maintained the alliance for 70 years because NATO is in America's vital national security interest. America benefits economically, politically, and militarily from the alliance. NATO and our other treaty allies are the single greatest geostrategic advantage we hold over any peer competitor. Russia and China have nothing to compare. In short, NATO is indispensable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lute. Mr. Brzezinski.
Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, distinguished members of the committee. As we approach NATO's 70th anniversary, thank you for conducting this hearing and allowing me to participate in this stock-taking of the alliance. NATO is an invaluable alliance. The transatlantic security architecture it provides has transformed former adversaries into allies and deterred outside aggression. European allies that are secure and at peace are inherently better able to work with the United States in addressing challenges beyond Europe. NATO has been a powerful force multiplier for the United States. Time and time again, European, Canadian, and U.S. military personnel have served and sacrificed shoulder to shoulder on battlefields in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere around the world. The alliance provides the United States the ability to leverage unmatched political, economic, and military power. NATO's actions benefit from the political legitimacy unique to this community of democracies. Its economic power, a combined total of some $40 trillion in GDP, dwarfs that of any rival. No other military alliance can field a force as capable as NATO. These assets only become more important in today's increasingly challenging security environment. That environment features, one, the return of great power competition, featuring Russia's revanchist ambitions and China's growing assertiveness. Second, a disturbing erosion of the rules-based order that has been the foundation of peace, freedom, and prosperity around the globe. Third, a growing collision between liberal democracy and authoritarian nationalism. Another significant dynamic is what some call the Fourth Industrial Revolution. It features the advent of hypersonic weapons, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and other technologies. These capabilities portend to radically redefine the requirements of military stability and security. These are reasons why NATO has only become more important. But as we look forward, NATO's agenda must include the following 5 priorities. First, the alliance must accelerate its efforts to increase its preparedness for high-intensity conflict. After the Cold War, NATO's force posture shifted toward peacekeeping and counterinsurgency. These were the demands generated by operations in the Balkans, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. Today, Russia's military aggressions and sustained military buildup have reanimated the need to prepare for high-intensity warfare, the likes of which we have not had to face since the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is a matter of real concern. It's notable, it's deeply concerning, that the commander of the United States European Command last week testified that he is not yet, quote, comfortable with the deterrent posture we have in Europe. He warned that, quote, a theater not sufficiently set for full-spectrum contingency operations poses increased risk for our ability to compete, deter aggression, and prevail in conflict if necessary, end quote. This reality underscores a second NATO priority. Canada and our European allies must invest more to increase their military capability and readiness for these kinds of contingencies. Their investments must address key NATO shortfalls, including air and missile defense, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and long-range fires, among others. Time is long overdue for these allies to carry their share of the security burden. Third, NATO must further reinforce its flanks in North Central Europe, the Black Sea region, and the Arctic. These are foci of Russia's military buildup, provocations, and aggression. In North Central Europe, the challenge is acute. The alliance has 4 enhanced forward presence battalions stationed in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. They are positioned against divisions of Russian ground forces backed by sophisticated aircraft, air defense, helicopters, ships, and missiles. Fourth, the alliance must more substantially embrace and support the membership aspirations of Ukraine and Georgia. NATO enlargement is one of the great success stories of post-Cold War Europe. It expanded the zone of peace and stability in that region and strengthened the alliance's military capability. But the alliance needs to provide Ukraine and Georgia a clear path to membership, recognizing it will take them time to meet the alliance's political and military requirements. There is a clear lesson from Moscow's invasions of Ukraine and Georgia. NATO's hesitancy regarding membership aspirations of these two nations has only animated Vladimir Putin's sense of opportunity to reassert Moscow's control over what has been allowed to become a destabilizing gray zone in Europe's strategic landscape. Finally, the alliance needs to actively consider the role it will play in the West's relationship with China. I agree with Doug. While China is not an immediate military threat to Europe, its actions against the rule-based international order affects Europe as it does America. NATO can play a constructive, if not significant, role in the West strategy to shape a more cooperative relationship with Beijing. As the United States confronts the challenges of the 21st century, there is no instrument more essential, indeed indispensable, than NATO. The political influence, economic power, and military might available through this community of democracies cannot be sustained in the absence of a robust U.S. military commitment to the alliance. That is the price of leadership, and it is one whose returns have been consistently advantageous to the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brzezinski. Let me ask this question, and let me have, starting with Ms. Flournoy, let me have each of you answer this. NATO has been called the most successful political military alliance in history, yet as we've all mentioned, some critics have claimed that NATO is obsolete or that the U.S. shares too large a burden within the alliance. The architects of the alliance, Truman, Acheson, Marshall, and Eisenhower, would be incredulous to learn that their creation, NATO, and the lasting Atlantic Partnership is now in question. Let me ask each of you, in your previous positions, would you have been able to execute our foreign policy and national security objectives without the support and contributions from our allies in NATO? Ms. Flournoy, let's start with you.
No, the short answer is no. NATO was a critical partner in enabling us to surge forces in Afghanistan. They were a critical partner in bolstering deterrence in Europe in the face of a more assertive and aggressive Russia. And NATO members individually have been critical partners in other operations like counterterrorism the world over. So NATO, in my experience, remained absolutely critical. It's the first place we would turn to for partners to accomplish shared objectives.
Thank you, Mr. Cholet.
Mr. Chairman, I completely agree with that. In my capacity at the Pentagon, serving for the Secretary of Defense, 3 times a year we would travel to NATO headquarters in Brussels to meet with his Minister of Defense counterparts. Secretary of State has their own meetings with their counterparts, and this became a way for us to coordinate, to plan, and to talk about crisis response and also issues over the horizon. NATO was absolutely our partner of first resort, and much of what we have been able to accomplish in Europe and elsewhere is unimaginable without having such a strong, enduring alliance.
Mr. Lute.
Mr. Chairman, I can only agree. I would argue further that, as Ms. Flournoy mentioned in her opening comments, if we didn't have NATO today, when we confronted the kind of challenges that the panel has outlined, we would actually be racing to discover NATO and to invent NATO. So it is, in fact, indispensable.
Thank you, Mr. Brzezinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I concur with my colleagues. We would not have been able to execute what we have done in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and the Balkans without our NATO allies. Sitting in the Pentagon, I saw firsthand how absolutely invaluable it is to have other countries whose militaries are not only fully interoperable, but have deep personal relationships among their commanders, among their NCOs. That is the reason why, when we have a contingency that requires multinational support, we turn to our NATO allies first. NATO is indispensable to U.S. security and too often to U.S. military operations beyond our border.
Thank you. Mr. Brzezinski, let me just stay with you and mention something, expand on something that you mentioned. I could not agree with you more when you spoke about NATO enlargement. I think NATO, frankly, missed the boat back in 2008 when they did not expand to include Ukraine and Georgia. I think that gave Putin the idea that he could do whatever he wanted and that we would not stand up to him, including all his things in Crimea and all his other belligerent manners. So I don't know if you want to expand on that. I just wanted to say that I agree with your comments.
Thank you, sir. You know, when we look at the Black Sea region, that is a zone of increasing confrontation with Russia. I do agree with you that if we had provided Ukraine and Georgia a more robust commitment to their transatlantic aspirations, it's less likely that Putin would have made his move against Georgia, and it's even less likely that he would have made his move against Ukraine. Putin thrives on weakness, and he exploits hesitancy and uncertainty. And unfortunately, the West's posture towards these two countries has created a de facto gray zone in European security. And that just whets the appetite of someone like Putin. If he sees an opportunity or senses there's not a lack of commitment to support another country along its border in their former Soviet space, he sees that as an opportunity to reanimate the hegemony that Moscow exerted during the Cold War. That's what he's about, and unfortunately, that is the position that we've put these countries in. And it's sad, because these countries seek NATO membership, and more often than not, they've actually sent troops to support our operations in the Balkans and in Afghanistan. I remember the dramatic footage of a Georgian platoon fighting in Afghanistan, defending our embassy, and doing a really good job of it. They need more support than we're providing us. we're providing them.
Thank you. Ms. Flournoy, let me ask you this. What would be the consequences of pulling our troops home or reducing the size of the U.S. presence in Europe? How would it impact our ability to project power globally, and could an ad hoc coalition take the place of our NATO basing and alliance network? If not, why not?
As we saw during the surge in Afghanistan and our combat mission there, our basing in Europe was absolutely critical as a hub for our rotational forces going in and out of that conflict. In addition, the fact that we'd been in Europe working with our allies in exercises and training and constantly working on interoperability, we experienced the benefits of that when we had to deploy together, whether it was in the Balkans or Afghanistan or elsewhere. So that basing has been a critical hub. Now that there's a returned threat to Europe itself with Russia's behavior, that those bases become absolutely critical as both a symbol of the U.S. commitment and resolve to defend Europe and our interests there, but also, a caution, a blinking yellow light to Vladimir Putin to say, if you come into NATO, across NATO's borders, you are immediately declaring war not only with Europe, but with the United States. So I think it's very important to maintain and strengthen. There are things I would do to strengthen that infrastructure in Europe, but I think it's very important to maintain it as a starting point.
Thank you. A few of you have mentioned China as a country that we need to be looking at very carefully for its aggressiveness and what it might do in the future. Wondering if any of you would, Mr. Cholet or Mr. Lute, would you want to comment on that? I forget which one of you mentioned it.
Well, I can take a first crack. I think China is something that NATO members need to begin to engage more seriously. I think there is more talk in Europe about looking at China as a security threat. Of course, there's been a lot of news recently about disputes between the United States and some European partners on China's investment, particularly in the technology space within Europe. But we're seeing China invest in infrastructure in Europe, ports, critical technologies, engaging more in the high north, and China engaging much more with Russia. Last year, there was a very large exercise in the Far East called Vostok 18 that involved hundreds of thousands of Russian troops, thousands of Chinese troops. And this is something that got a lot of attention by our military commanders in Europe and in Asia. It's evidence of greater cooperation between Russia and China, cooperation that our intelligence community has testified publicly before Congress is something they're watching. So although there are many aspects to the China challenge, and the security piece is just one, I think this is something that I see NATO engaging much more deeply in the coming 5 to 10 years. And I think that there's a willingness in Europe to do so.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'm not so concerned about China's military impact on Europe, but I am concerned about, as Derek Cholet mentioned, China's increasing commercial influence. It's buying its way into transportation infrastructure, IT, communications infrastructure, and so forth. We've seen early signs that those commercial investments are leading to political influence. They expect a political return on their commercial investment. And even more, I think, strategically important, over the next 2 to 3 decades, it's clear that the U.S.-Chinese competition will be at the forefront of world politics. And we should ask ourselves as Americans, do we wish to compete with China alone, or would we favor an arrangement where we have 29 like-minded allies on our side as we enter into this geostrategic competition that's going to define the rest of our lives? I would clearly prefer to go in with a NATO team.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Mr. Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me say unequivocally, I believe the value of NATO is absolute, or as near absolute as it gets, to mitigate war, to deter, and when there is a problem, to act decisively as a team to thwart any potential adversary. I don't think it's at risk. I think there's a lot of hyperbole about NATO's continuance being thrown about. I don't think it's at risk at all. I've been in Congress 39 years. There's bipartisan support for it. There's White House support for it. So I think there's a lot of hyperbole about that issue. I led a delegation to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. We had a bilateral with the Germans, with members of the Bundestag, as well as other people in their defense establishment there, last July. And I came away very profoundly disturbed by their unwillingness and inability to meet that 2% GDP target. Matter of fact, it's at 1.24% now, and their excuses, and I would appreciate perhaps Mr. Lute or others who might want to speak to this, where, well, the population just won't go along with that kind of defense increase. It's okay for the U.S. to do it. I'm glad we do, but to step up and say they can't do this politically, I thought was as weak as it gets, if you could speak to that. Secondly, to Michelle Flournoy, during the 2012 presidential election, you appeared in a political commercial in reaction to Mitt Romney's statement that Russia was our #1 geopolitical foe. You stated in the commercial that it's really a curious statement given that the Cold War has been over for some time, indicating that Russia was not the threat that Mr. Romney had suggested and that he was stuck in the past. In your testimony before us today, however, you term Russia revisionist and cite Moscow's continued aggression in the region. Russia, and I was in Tbilisi a week after they invaded South Ossetia. Anyone who had any thoughts that Putin was somehow matriculating from dictatorship to democratic leader, I'll sell you the Brooklyn Bridge if you believe that. And they might have even gone further if there wasn't at least some strong statements coming out of the administration at that point. But I was wondering if you could tell us which of those statements should the committee believe today. Thirdly, let me ask, with regards to INSTEX, INSTEX, many of us are very concerned about the roundabout efforts that are being made by many, including Germany, France, and the UK, to undermine our ability to sanction, whether it be global Magnitsky or whether it be our efforts against Tehran. When you find some other way of circumventing what the U.S. is doing with often very strong support of the Congress, I think it undermines our ability to promote an Iranian regime, sanctions that, in my opinion, are very justified, as well as, again, the Global Magnitsky Act. So, Mr. Lute, if you could maybe start on that first one about Germany. I mean, 1.24% is weak, and it's, in my opinion, indefensible.
Congressman, I can only agree with you. Germany was present at the Wales summit. Germany agreed, as all allies did, on the 2% pledge, and Germany is underperforming at 1.24%. It is the largest, strongest economy in the alliance next to ours. It is a political ally that aspires to European and maybe even global leadership, and leadership comes with a price. And this is simply a matter of German political leaders coming together and forming a coalition as their system requires, and building political support for this. Political support doesn't fall from trees. It has to be built, as the Congress obviously knows. So I can only agree with you. There's no excuse.
Thank you.
Yes, Congressman. So I did make that statement, and it was at a time when we were actually having some success in cooperation with Russia. This is before Putin sort of increased his more aggressive behavior. We were negotiating New START, arms control. We were policing up nuclear materials and cleaning out proliferation risks. We had Russian agreement to allow us to transit Russian territory and they're near abroad to supply Afghanistan. So I'm just saying it was a moment in time. I think now looking back, knowing what we know now and how Putin has behaved and where Russia has gone with its aggression, I think that I would revise that statement, or I wouldn't have made that statement. I would have thought that now, Romney had a certain degree of foresight that I think was not apparent at the time.
Okay, and Romney wasn't alone in that. Many of us strongly objected to those kinds of
Right, but I
Matter
think,
of fact, I'm
I think
glad
we can all
Secretary
agree that
Albright
Russia is very
said
much
it
a
as well,
threat today.
that we underestimated Russia. That last question, if anybody can speak to it. Circumventing our sanctions regimes with, and working actively against us, and there are members of NATO doing it.
Well,
With INSTEX?
Yeah, on the Russia, or on Iran and the JCPOA, obviously that's not been a NATO issue, although NATO members are very much party to this dispute. And of course, this issue has been incredibly divisive between the U.S. and Europe and will remain divisive. Europe is indeed trying to find a way to maintain the integrity of the JCPOA with this new mechanism. I have my doubts, frankly, whether this new mechanism is going to get anywhere. They've just launched it. Whether it will prove successful or not, nevertheless, whether that exists or not, there will still remain a profound disagreement with our U.S. and European partners on the JCPOA and how to handle the threat from Iran's nuclear program. That is not a subject, the JCPOA specifically, is not a subject that NATO talks much about within the councils of Brussels. However, the threat from Iran is something that NATO talks about around the table in Brussels and thinks quite a bit about from a military planning perspective.
Thank you. Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of the witnesses. You know, NATO has undoubtedly been one of the most successful alliances in history, promoting peace, security, democracy since its inception. And at the signing of the original Washington Treaty 70 years ago, President Truman remarked that NATO would, and I quote, would create a shield against aggression and fear of aggression, a bulwark which will permit us to get on with the real business of achieving a fuller and happier life for all of our citizens. To me, those words are truer now than ever before. And prior to this administration, it would have been unimaginable to question the value of our NATO alliance and pass resolutions prohibiting the president from pulling out of this strategic partnership of which he's threatened to do. And yet, that is exactly where we're here, where we are today. And when I was recently in attendance at the Munich Security Conference, I was deeply concerned that at that time, not just a few weeks ago, that the president went on to Twitter to threaten the release of 800 captured ISIS fighters on the streets of Europe. Just think about that for a second. Today, we are here in agreement on the importance of NATO, a point that I think our president disregards. And the only thing I will say also in regards to Germany, I understand that they need to step up, but they're not talking about building a wall. They are letting millions of refugees in and spending money on that, not building a wall to separate themselves, but accepting many individuals and trying to make sure that there is better integration into the European, and they don't get credit for that. And just think about that cost to the German people and what the chancellor is subjecting herself to by just doing that. And those things should be taken into consideration at all times, I think. And we don't talk about that enough, where we are building a wall and separating people and dividing people and not supporting our NATO. So let me ask Ms. Flournoy that how has President Trump's questioning of the value of our NATO allies affected our ability to effectively push back against Russia's aggression? And I agree with you, because I too was fooled. I started, that's the reason why I was a supporter of PNTR right before Putin came back. I thought that we were moving in a post-World War, a post-Cold War, and Putin came back and we are where we are. But how effectively we push back against Russia's aggression and address other security challenges that's now confronted in Europe?
So for all the strength of our military-to-military cooperation with our NATO allies, I think the statements coming from the President questioning not only our allies' contributions, but the U.S. commitment to NATO and the value of the alliance, I think that has frankly played right into Vladimir Putin's hands. If you look at Russia's objectives, what Putin is trying to reassert Russia as a great power. He's trying to recreate a sphere of influence, and he's going to try to undermine democracy as a model of government. There's nothing that makes him happier than to see division inside the alliance, to try to sow division and weaken the transatlantic relationship. And so this is playing right into Putin's hands. This is far more effective than the disinformation campaigns that he's been launching, that the meddling in our elections and European elections has resulted in. So I think I'm very worried that at the strategic level, the lack of U.S. clear commitment and resolve and consistency and leadership in the alliance is frankly, strengthening Putin's hand and undermining our own.
Thank you. Mr. Cholet, let me ask you, because NATO has an open door policy, and we now look at maybe North Macedonia, a new ally, a part of the NATO. Now, what would you say to those who argue against NATO's enlargement? You know, are there any real concerns that newer, smaller members of NATO could drag us into a conflict, and can you elaborate on why enlargement has benefited NATO?
Well, as my fellow panelists have said, NATO enlargement, in my view, is one of the great success stories of the NATO alliance. It was just yesterday that we celebrated the 20th anniversary of NATO's first round of post-Cold War enlargement, letting in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Something that the United States, it's important to remember, a process the U.S. drove and brought these countries into the alliance, working with our partners. I think, first, having more capable partners serves the U.S. interests. And the process of getting into NATO just doesn't happen overnight. This is a long, rigorous process that requires many, many political and military reforms from member states. So I think it's very, very important that to achieve our goals of having more capable partners and ensuring that we have a Europe that is whole, free, and at peace, that we keep this door open. That's why I think we should celebrate the fact that North Macedonia appears on the cusp of entering the alliance later this year. And I want to concur with my colleague, Mr. Brzezinski, that it's very important for the alliance to clarify a pathway forward for those allies that has already said one day will be in the alliance, and that's Georgia and Ukraine. And I think it's time to try to take the next step in articulating more concretely how that will happen.
Thank you. Mr. McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Russia's been in violation of the INF Treaty for many years. Putin has indicated his intent to build new and more sophisticated missiles to threaten our allies. I agreed with the President's decision to withdraw from the INF Treaty, and I commend our NATO allies for supporting that decision unanimously. Mr. Brzezinski and I guess Mr. Cholet, what can NATO do now to prevent this and deter this Russia missile development program?
Thank you, sir. You know, the Russians have been in violation of the INF Treaty for at least 10 years. And when you have one party of a treaty not abiding by it, its utility diminishes and maybe even becomes counterproductive if you're not willing to directly address that digression, that violation. I think the administration made the smart move in pulling out or announcing its intent to withdraw from the INF Treaty. I think it is wisely signaled to the Russians that if they are ready and demonstrate that they will destroy the existing inventory of intermediate-range missiles they have built, and I think it's about a brigade's worth, that we will go back. I think that's the right thing to do. The goal is to now figure out how we can avoid another destabilizing arms race, so to speak, an arms race with two sides building nuclear-capable intermediate-range missiles ground-launched. That's what the INF pulled off the table, so to speak. Looking forward, I think the following things. One, it would be useful if the Russians won't take up the administration's offer, we might consider proposing to the Russians an agreement in which we would agree that we will not deploy nuclear-capable ground-launched intermediate-range missiles. We could complement that maybe with limits on the number of missiles each side can have. And of course, this would have to include also very, very robust inspection regimes. We could consider joint renunciation of deploying nuclear INF range missiles. Our response also has to figure out what will we do as the Russians move forward with these deployments. And there are conventional responses we can take into account. The deployment of more robust air and missile defense systems. If there's one thing that's lacking in the administration's response, I think it's as follows. they have not publicly stated what are the implications of this violation. They just said basically, they're in violation, and so therefore we're going to get out of it. But to me, but it's clear, this can be potentially extremely destabilizing. And the administration should be articulating, and how is it destabilizing? What are the military implications of this? I am wondering if they have tasked the alliance or NATO's military commander to do an assessment of what happens if the Russians deploy 100, 200, 500 of these systems. What are the implications for the alliance's posture? What should be the response? Such an assessment and such a public articulation of such an assessment would do a lot to help garner more public and international support for the administration's position.
The remaining time I have, I wanted the other three to comment. Turkey has become a precarious ally in many ways. Their rejection of the Patriot missiles and now willingness to buy the Russian S-400 missile system is a challenge for NATO members. And the NATO Supreme Allied Commander said that if they went ahead with this purchase, that the United States should not follow through with selling them F-35s. Could Michelle and Mr. Chalet and Mr. Liu, could you comment on that?
Congressman, I completely agree with your assessment of the concern of Turkey's purchase of the Russian air defense system. This has been something that, going back to the Obama administration, has been made clear to Turkish counterparts the mistake this would be, both in terms of what we believe is their cooperation within NATO and the fact that there would be real consequences beyond NATO, as you mentioned, the F-35, for example. And so one would hope that the Turks change their minds on this. I am doubtful, having had conversations with some Turkish officials recently, that they're going to do so. They feel quite defiant about it. I think this would be a mistake. It would weaken alliance unity. This is one of those issues that is an irritant in alliance debates. And Turkey is a frontline partner. I mean, Turkey has been, we should not forget, been living with a hot war on its border for quite some time. And so in many ways, NATO has come to Turkey's support as it's dealt with the ramifications of the Syria crisis.
And
but
my time is, if I could just get a quick response from Ms. Flournoy and Mr. Lute, I apologize.
I was fully supportive of General Scaparotti's testimony in terms of it from a technical and intelligence risk perspective. It's impossible if they go ahead with the deployment of the S-400s and integrate that into their systems. It will create very real constraints on what we were able to do with them in terms of any kind of advanced defense cooperation or future provision of future systems, including the F-35. So I think this is a real problem, and what Turkey needs to understand is that they're making not just tactical choices, systems choices, but strategic choices, and this will limit their ability to cooperate effectively within the alliance.
Mr. Lute.
I agree this is a tactical bad choice on behalf of Turkey, but the broader, more strategic issue is Turkey's significant slippage from the democratic values of the alliance. There's no ally among the 29 who has slipped further and faster from the founding core values of the alliance and has moved towards authoritarianism. So that's the big strategic issue.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to get back. There were earlier remarks about China. 2 weeks ago, I was in Munich and in Brussels talking to political and security leaders as well as NATO leaders, and came away with a strong feeling that in the longer term, China could be our greatest challenge right now. If we were going to look back 25 years from now, if things stay the same, that's where I think we might be showing the greatest concern. So I'd just like to go further with this. There's so much Chinese activity, investments. They just purchased a robotics company in Germany. They're working with Hungary and proposed rail lines through Serbia, Bulgaria. They're doing investments in ports, all with strings attached. And we're hearing in North Africa some of the buyer's remorse from some of the countries that have been dealing with China. But in Europe, this is a real threat. So what can our NATO members do to insulate members from this? What can the U.S. do? I know I'm involved in alternatives in terms of energy investment. alternatives in Europe to provide more options and to help our exporting now that we're in there. But what kind of things can we do to insulate ourselves and to deal with what I think is the greatest long-range threat that we have through China and these investments?
If I may, sir, I think it's an excellent question. I do think the strategic competition with China will be kind of the pacing issue for our national security going forward. Europe is sort of a backdoor to get Western technology for China. If they can't, if they're thwarted in their intellectual property theft from us, they will try to get it through our European allies. They are making infrastructure investments. The case of the port in Italy is just the most recent example, not because of some economic driver, but because they're trying to get political influence. They're trying to gain leverage. And ultimately, they're also, with their companies like Huawei and others, trying to put in networks and infrastructure that could be used by the state for intelligence and espionage purposes in the future if it came to that. So we have to be very clear-eyed. I think we want to intensify our discussions with each of our NATO partners in Europe and the EU. We want to encourage them to put in place CFIUS-like regulation, meaning they need to be very careful to review foreign investment in their countries from a national security perspective and be very clear-eyed. We need to be doing better and sharing intelligence about what we see China doing. But to Doug's point earlier, Ambassador Lutz's point, we're missing an opportunity. The best way for the U.S. to compete with China is, first of all, to invest at home in our domestic drivers of competitiveness, but also to band together with our European allies and our Asian allies. Together, we are 60% of the world's GDP. If we were taking China on not in a bilateral tariff tit-for-tat kind of dispute, but banding together with the EU, Japan, Korea, all of our allies in Asia, we would have so much more leverage to force China to address some of the unfair practices that it's had on trade over the years.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think we're taking just the opposite approach. Tariffs are divisive. If we ever move on the automobile tariffs, it would be more divisive. It's a lose-lose proposition, but we share the same values with our European Union allies. And it's those values that are in competition right now with China. And why not deal from a position of strength and move forward for free trade agreements there, and then really be in a strength position to deal with China? So I couldn't agree more. Just one quick question. You know, the elections are coming in Europe, and we're seeing, you know, I think democracy's more a threat with autocratic leaders and autocratic. How is that backslide a concern, and what can we do with the NATO countries and our European allies to try and help in that regard?
Congressman, I can take a crack at that. It's a big concern. The democratic backsliding we're seeing in many countries in the alliance is something that is becoming increasingly divisive within the alliance and making it harder to maintain alliance unity. There's not just disputes between the U.S. and European partners, there are disputes within Europe over the direction of politics on the continent. That's why I think it's important to remember NATO's core, which is the values. It is a military alliance, but it's about much, much more than capabilities. And I think that's why it's so important for NATO to remain strong, for the U.S. to uphold those values and remain committed to its leadership in the alliance. A lot of these issues have nothing to do with NATO, but NATO, as that core of the transatlantic partnership, will be an absolutely indispensable tool in helping us address some of that democratic backsliding in the European Union.
Well, thank you. I'd just say it has everything to do with it, too, if you look at it from that perspective. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson.
And thank you very much, Chairman Engel and Republican Leader McCall. What extraordinary time to have a recognition of the 70th anniversary of NATO. And I want to thank each of you for being here. And as I think of the 70th anniversary of NATO, we now have the broadest spread of freedom and democracy than in the history of the world, particularly with the former Warsaw Pact members now members of NATO. How exciting this is, and the success of NATO needs to be recognized. Mr. Brzezinski, Secretary General Stoltenberg has actually praised the President for his efforts to have all the members of NATO increase their participation financially. What is your view about the financial contributions by our NATO allies?
I think those contributions are still short. They're making improvement. Secretary General Stoltenberg likes to emphasize that since 2016, we've had a $41 billion increase in their defense spending, and it's on track to be $100 billion by 2020. That is good, and it should be recognized. I think it's actually 8 countries now that are going to be this year at the 2% mark, and 10 have pledged to meet that by 2024, which is progress. But there are about to be 30 members in the alliance. So we're just over 50% of the alliance living up to the 2% pledge. It's urgent because challenges that we face today are growing increasingly ominous. I mean, the risks posed by Russia's military buildup in North Central Europe, in the Black Sea region, require a more robust investment. We were talking about Germany. It's appalling at German spending levels, particularly in light of the readiness of their forces. I'm not convinced they really have the capability to even generate 2 brigades in 30 days to reinforce NATO's eastern frontier. And they're in the backyard, so to speak. So, yes, there is progress being made. I think the administration can be commended for prodding that progress in sometimes undiplomatic way, sometimes an even counterproductive way. But the progress is happening, but a lot more needs to be done. 50% meeting 2% is not sufficient. That's not the end state we seek. We need 100% commitment to 2%. And we need to kind of, I think more broadly about how we measure the outputs of that 2%. I would like to see a return to inspections of committed allied forces. That is, during the Cold War, I think it was SHAPE, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, would do inspections of the forces that NATO members committed to alliance operations or alliance contingency plans. Those inspections ought to be reinstated. They could be conducted by SHAPE or Allied Command Transformation, and they ought to be reported to the ministers. And I think there ought to be a public dimension of that reporting, because that is a good way to increase the pressure and to give on governments, and also to give publics confidence that their money is being well spent.
Thank you. Another, to me, extraordinary achievement has been NATO forces being placed in the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the presence of American troops in Poland. For each of you, how significant is this as a deterrent? And in particular, in Poland, I had the opportunity to meet with President Duda in New York last summer, and it was so exciting to hear him explain how he would like to have actually a permanent American military presence that they would pay for, they would provide, and the relationship that we have with Poland has just never been better. But Secretary Flournoy, everyone, what is the significance of having these troops as a deterrent, peace through strength?
I think having NATO troops, including U.S. troops, in the Baltics is essential to signal to Vladimir Putin that if he comes across the border, he's not just attacking Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania. He is taking on the United States and the full force of NATO. I do think there are things we can do to strengthen our presence along the frontline states, including pre-positioning more heavy equipment, including readying more bases to be able to receive forces if it came to that in a crisis. I think the question of whether any additional presence in Poland should be permanent versus rotational deserves further study. But I really applaud Congress's support and this committee's support for the European Reassurance Initiative and the continued funding that DoD is providing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Sherman.
We're arguing that they should spend 2% on their national defense. We're also trying to argue to the American people that if they hit 2%, they're doing enough. So we have the foreign policy establishment is arguing in both directions. Tell the American people, settle for what you get, and tell the NATO countries to spend more. 2% is a benchmark that needs to be compared with what percent are we spending, And what is the commonly used figure that we use to talk to the Europeans about what percent of our GDP we're spending? Do we typically say something like 3% or 3.5%? Which of you is most familiar with what number we use? I see Mr. Scholl at Mr. Luke.
So we have consensus here. We typically cite 3.5%.
Right, and the fact is, that's our effort to lie to the American people, because we've got a two-angle here. We spend much closer to 5.5%. Now, how can you lie to the American people to tell them what Europe is doing is adequate? Well, what you do is you exclude veterans' benefits as if the pension costs, I'm an old CPA. If you had any other company, if you had any company that in not listing the costs of its product excluded its pension costs, they'd go to jail. That's how big a violation it is of accounting principles. So you exclude veterans, you exclude the Coast Guard, you exclude the CIA, and that helps with one part, which is trying to tell the American people Europe is doing enough. But it undercuts our efforts to get Europe to do more, because they say, well, if we hit 2%, you guys are at 3.5%, we're in the ballpark. Why is it, in arguing with Europe, that we decide that the Coast Guard doesn't count, the CIA doesn't count, and veterans benefits doesn't count?
So I think I can address that. So NATO actually has rules about what counts and what doesn't count. So typically, the shorthand...
And why have we agreed to rules that massively understate what any reasonable accountant would say we're spending?
So I'm not sure, Congressman, why we agreed that, but the standard has been for decades that basically Ministry of Defense budget.
I understand. Europe, there's Article 5 and there's Article 5. No one in the world knows what the U.S. response would be to an attack on an Eastern European country. We would clearly do something. There's an image that as long as we're legally in NATO, we will respond as we did in World War II, and/or with the full force of our nuclear weapons. Is there any discussion in Europe that goes along the lines of, hey, if the American people think that we're only doing 2% or we're doing less than 2%, we're on the front lines, and that's all we did, that maybe the U.S. response wouldn't be any greater than NATO's response that when America was attacked by the Taliban and al-Qaeda. That is to say, the U.S. might send a few hundred troops, a few thousand troops, but would not reinstitute the draft, endanger the American cities. Is there any discussion in Europe that Article 5 compliance could be anything between a few hundred troops on the one hand and massive nuclear war on the other? Or do they just assume that they get a World War II level response?
So, Congressman, NATO actually conducts war games, often with our Secretary of Defense participating.
But it'll ultimately be a political decision. You do war games in 2019, that doesn't mean that the United States in 2029 will allow use tactical nuclear weapons against a Russian army.
Right, but these exercises reflect your point, which is that there's a lot of ambiguity in Article 5, and there's a range of potential national responses.
Is there any discussion in Europe that the ultimate political decision within that range to their defense, and more importantly for them, the image to Russia of what that would be, is dependent upon the American people's view as to whether they're carrying their own weight?
Sure, if I could share my perspective. What I think Europeans who are in decision-making capacities do is they look at what our footprint is in Europe, how much we spend on Europe, and what kind of operations we do in Europe. So when they look at our footprint, they've seen actually a return of U.S. forces to Europe. not only just a return of U.S. forces, but a forward deployment of those forces in North Central Europe.
I understand that the elites of Europe look at what the establishment in the United States does, which is engage in those war games. But ultimately, the decision in 2029 or 2039, or God hope this never happens, will not be made in Washington. It'll be made in Peoria and Wichita, and the American people will decide. And I know that had the decision been made in Washington by the establishment, we would have responded robustly to Assad's use of chemical weapons. And then we heard from our constituents when President Obama asked for congressional support, and I got 4 calls saying, go bomb Assad, and 500 calls on the other side. So are the Europeans, and I realize I've gone over time, but it seems like the Europeans are focusing on whether they're meeting Washington standards and not whether they're meeting the American people's standards, and I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the panel for being here. I don't personally believe that the American people think that there's a threat to the NATO alliance, and I think they certainly appreciate the value to the free world, and that it's better to stem the tide of totalitarianism, communism, socialism, and violence on those borders as opposed to having come to our shores. So I completely reject the straw man argument that this president is flirting with leaving NATO legitimately, even in the face of the fact that only 8 of the NATO countries, as you've Secretary Brzezinski pointed out, have met the requirement, and while 21 are falling well short, including Germany. And the American taxpayer, they understand that as well. They don't mind making the investment, but they don't want to be used and abused to defend Europe wholly and completely from here. But let me ask a couple questions. Secretary General Stoltenberg just last month at the Munich Security Conference said, "I'm saying that that President Trump's message has been very clear and that his message is having an impact on defense spending. And this is important because we need fair burden sharing in the NATO alliance." Secretary Flournoy, is he wrong? Was he wrong to say that?
No, I think that President Trump's pressure and Secretary Mattis's pressure, along with their predecessors, Secretary Gates, Secretary Panetta, others, we've been imploring the allies to do more, and that is correct. I think the objection is to using the 2% as the sole criteria for evaluating allied contributions.
But nothing has worked in the past, right? Let me move on here. This is a statement we've heard recently.
I think Ukraine and Crimea has had something to do with the increased spending as well.
And it should, but these are some other statements. This is a statement we've heard recently. If we've got collective defense, it means that everybody's got to chip in. And I have had some concerns about a diminished level of defense spending among our partners in NATO, not all, but many. And then another statement, one of the things that I think medium and long term we'll have to examine is whether everybody is chipping in. Secretary Brzezinski, do you know who said those 2 things? That was President Obama that said that. And so my question for you is, to many people, he made disparaging comments about our NATO allies, going as far as calling them free riders. And if that's the case, why is it that President Obama, who seemed to have some of the very similar rhetoric towards our allies, was not successful in getting them to try and meet their obligation, but also wasn't criticized for it? Why do you suppose that is?
I think it's politics.
Sounds fair to me. I mean, but we're talking about international and national security, and it doesn't seem to be the place for politics. I mean, Secretary Gates, under President Obama, said that in 2011 in Brussels that NATO had a dim, if not dismal, future unless more member nations scaled up their participation in alliance activities. Let me ask you this, Secretary Flournoy. In your testimony, you say that using the 2% GDP goal as the only measure of burden sharing ignores other critical contributions and, most importantly and unforgivably, their shared sacrifice. Moving on, this is disrespectful, short-sighted, and wrong. Now, your former boss, Secretary Gates, criticized NATO members for not meeting their commitments. Would you say that he was that he was disrespectful, short-sighted, and wrong as well?
No, because he wasn't using the 2% metric as the only metric of NATO contribution. I helped write the speech that you're referring to from Secretary Gates. We've had bipartisan support from Bush, Obama, and Trump trying to get the allies to do more, and that is a correct policy. But it should not be the only metric by which we judge their contributions to our security. My point was they've fought and died alongside us. We should never overlook that in the way that we address our allies in terms of.
So let me just ask you this rhetorically. If that's the case, and okay, I'll have an open mind about it, will our NATO partners and allies be upset and be critical of the United States if we reduce our contribution lower than 2%, saying, well, look, we do a whole lot of other things as well, and we don't want to only be measured by this 2% because we do a whole lot of other things as well that aren't included in the 2%. Is that going to be fair?
Again, no. I think the 2% metric is important and valid and should be met. It's just not the only metric that we should use.
But it can't be a one-way street.
It
cannot be a one-way street. The American taxpayer
true.
realizes,
Absolutely.
respects
Should not be a
the
one-way
investment.
street. We are in violent agreement.
But we demand our NATO partners and allies meet their obligations
Yes,
as well.
but we should do it without calling into question their ability to rely on us as the leader
We're
of
not
the
calling into
alliance
question
and
their
our
ability to
commitment
rely
Article
on
5.
us, but I would say that past administrations have demanded the same thing as this president and got zero results. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Berra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listening to my colleagues' line of questioning, and I think in a bipartisan way, we would like our NATO allies to step up and carry more of the burden. I think the difference between prior administrations and the current administration, I don't think we disagree with President Trump asking the question and pushing for greater contribution. I do think many of us are uncomfortable and disagree with the premise that we should pull out of NATO. And even that rhetoric, I think, is very dangerous and sends the wrong signal to our friends and allies. We can modernize what this alliance looks like. We share values, and if our allies across the world are listening, as well as our adversaries, I think this body, when we pass the NATO Support Act, 357 to 22, in a broad bipartisan way, saying that we would not be pulling out of NATO, is speaking loudly, and that is what Congress should be doing. I urge my colleagues in the Senate to take this act up and send it to the President, and I would urge the President to sign this, because that is the message of this body. In that light, as we start to think about Congress's role in supporting our alliances, in sending the message, many members of Congress will be here longer than 4 years, and from one administration to the next. And I think NATO has served us incredibly well in the post-World War II environment. We're not suggesting that we don't need to modernize those alliances and look at it, but these are institutions that have served us well, maybe starting with Ms. Flournoy and just going across. What would you like to see Congress's oversight role be, and how can we best provide that?
I would welcome, as Mr. Chalet recommended, a strong congressional vote, both houses, in support of NATO and the value of NATO to U.S. national security and the continued U.S. commitment to the alliance. Beyond that, in terms of your oversight role, I think it's important we get beyond the, yes, the 2% metric is important. I acknowledge that and fully support it. I spent a lot of time in my previous capacity pushing our allies on this issue. But I think it's much more important to ask, how is that money being spent? How is NATO really investing to be prepared for a different set of future challenges than the ones that have defined our operational focus over the last 2 decades? That is the key question. It's a question of the type of readiness, it's the type of posture and positioning, it's the technology investment, it's all of those things. And so getting it beyond just the 2% to say, how are we actually spending money, and is that going to bolster deterrence and prevent conflict in the future?
Mr. Schlatt.
Congressman, three ways that Congress's role is indispensable. First, on the oversight, obviously ensuring that the United States maintains robust funding for its security and diplomatic efforts in Europe is something that we're going to look to Congress to ensure. I took note that in the administration's budget request this week, there's a $600 million cut in the European Defense Initiative, and that's something I know your colleagues on the Armed Services Committee will take a close look at, what's behind that. Number two, efforts, as Ambassador Lute has mentioned, for Congress to not just show its support, but help protect NATO in some ways, and U.S. leadership in NATO, by ensuring that there is a very high bar that the executive should get over if there is a desire to pull out or diminish in some way the U.S. role in NATO. And then third, as has been mentioned by many members of this committee, just your personal engagement in these issues, traveling to NATO headquarters, traveling to Europe, not just to listen and talk about your support, but also to press NATO on the important reforms that we all agree in a bipartisan fashion it needs, whether that's on defense spending or defense modernization. I think that's a very critical role that you all can play.
Congressman, I'd only cite the 50-some members of the Congress, both on the Senate and the House, who went, as some members of this committee did, to Munich just within the last month. That's the largest congressional delegation in the 55-year history of the Munich Security Conference. That sends a very important message. So Congress to parliamentary engagement is really important, and I wouldn't, aside from that, I'd echo everything my colleagues have said.
Sir, I'll just quickly reiterate what my colleagues have said. I'd start by saying thank you for the resolutions that this body has passed in real time to demonstrate congressional support for the alliance. That was incredibly important last summer. I'd second Derek's call. Whatever can be done to kind of ensure there's continued funding for the European Deterrence Initiative is important in light of the threat scenarios we face in Europe. And in terms of oversight, I'd recommend that you look into, on a regular basis, what are the readiness levels, not just of the United States, but of our allies. Do a deep dive on how ready our German, French, UK, Polish battalions, brigades, aircraft, how sustainable and how deployable they are. And then I would also do a deep dive into what kind of contributions are our allies making to military operations. And you'll get a mixed picture from such oversight, but it'll be helpful because it'll help prompt our allies in the right direction.
Great, thank you, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. I appreciate it. We all know that NATO is an important institution, and it's not just, I think it's important to remember that it's not just a benefit to Europe. I think we get as much of a benefit out of NATO as Europe gets out of it, out of our involvement. We all know the invocation of Article 5 after 9/11, the importance of that, NATO's role, including some folks that aren't in NATO. When you think of the nation of Georgia, for instance, helping us in Afghanistan is important to keep in mind. But I think we all understand the importance of NATO, but I don't think there's anything wrong with us or an administration pointing out weaknesses in an alliance. In fact, I think that's essential. And sometimes in our fervor to reaffirm NATO, we skip over the reality that I remember hearing about one European country that I won't mention that in the Balkans was unable to muster any combat power for that conflict because they realized the vast majority of their defense budget was actually just being spent on paying salaries, which makes it just a jobs program and not a military at that point. And you look at, the importance of our job in that, so reaffirming that's important, but I think you also have to give the administration some flexibility in terms of calling NATO out on their weakness like that. Congress can play an important role, but I think Congress can overplay our hand sometimes too, in consistently saying that, we're going to affirm NATO no matter what, regardless of their percent of GDP they're spending, as an example. This committee later today is going to hear a bill to prohibit military action or authorization of action in Venezuela, which out of nowhere I found out we're doing, and where in the world? How do you take away the power of an administration to use military as even a carrot in terms of a diplomatic negotiation? And the first thing this committee did was already deauthorize the administration's involvement in Yemen. So I think empowering an administration is extremely important, but we all realize the importance of NATO today. So Ukraine, I want to talk specifically about. They continue to face, as we know, significant challenges from Russia, from Russian meddling and aggression, as Vladimir Putin seeks to rebuild the former Soviet Union. And I think the best way to push back against Russia is to give the Ukrainians what they need to defend their sovereignty, such as anti-tank Javelin missile systems that we delivered last year, and any further support that they need in that. Back in November, Russia violated Ukraine's sovereignty yet again when it seized 3 Ukrainian vessels along with its 24 sailors as they passed through neutral waters in the Kerch Straits. Mr. Brzezinski, General Scaparrotti, the current Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, recently testified that the administration is looking to deliver more lethal weapons to Ukraine. Do you believe this will help to defer further conflicts between Russia and Ukrainian forces?
Absolutely. I think while our support has improved to Ukraine in providing lethal assistance, we need to do more so that Ukraine is better able to defend itself. Right now, it remains very vulnerable. I would add to the list that we have, and we are doing things that are useful, like helping the Ukrainians train their forces and such, but the only lethal assistance we've provided have been the javelins. We should complement that with more capable ISR systems they can use. We may even want to do our own ISR flights over Ukraine just to keep the Russians on notice that we're watching. We should give them air defense assets, and we should also give them anti-ship missiles like the Harpoon, so that we don't have events occurring like we saw in the Sea of Azov again.
Thank you. I think the important thing to note is I don't always agree with the administration's words or lack of words on Russia, and I call that out every time I can. But words versus actions are really significant. I think this administration's actions against Russia and actions Ukraine are far different than what we've seen in the past. I'm not a point back to the past kind of guy, but when you look at the prior assistance to the Ukrainian military, it was basically blankets. That really doesn't do a lot in terms of pursuing, allowing Ukraine to defend its territory. And there are reports that Germany and France declined the United States' request to exercise freedom of navigation drills for the Kerch Strait last year. While both countries were willing to do a single maneuver, they were unwilling to navigate those waters out of fear of provocation. Mr. Brzezinski, how could we help to entice our NATO allies that we so strongly believe in to join us in showing Vladimir Putin that we won't accept his illegal activity in the Crimean Peninsula?
I think in that case, you always find allies that will be in disagreement with you. And so you have to move forward without them sometimes. That's why I think it was very important for the administration to move forward with providing lethal weapons, the javelins, to Ukraine and to Georgia. If we're going to lead our allies, we actually have to lead by doing. And so the recommendations I outlined for you would be actions that I would take that would benefit the Ukrainians, that would help deter the Russians, and would also, I think, help lead some of our European allies to recognize our actions are sound rather than unwise.
I think Vladimir Putin's a smart guy, but I don't think he's eager to cross red lines. I just think we need to paint those red lines brighter with our allies. So thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Liu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since we're at a Foreign Affairs hearing, I just thought it might be appropriate to announce that today is day 26 of our national emergency. I note for the record that the President played golf this weekend in the middle of our national emergency. But I want to talk about a real emergency right now, which is the destabilization of NATO by Donald J. Trump and his enablers. And we know, based on various news articles and public reports, that in 2018, Donald Trump talked about withdrawing from NATO. So, Ms. Flournoy, let me ask you, if the U.S. were to withdraw from NATO, would that help U.S. national security?
No, I believe it would be catastrophic.
Would it help Russia?
Yeah, as I've said, I think any weakening of the transatlantic alliance plays into Vladimir Putin's hand, weakens deterrence, and strengthens Russia's ability to meddle in our affairs and to advance their objectives.
Thank you. Donald Trump also questioned Article 5 of NATO, which is the core of NATO's alliance. If the United States were to not abide by Article 5, would that help U.S. national security? And if you can answer that.
It would be devastating.
All right. Would it help Russia?
Absolutely.
All right. I also want to just quote from the national security strategy of the Trump administration. Quote, experience suggests that the willingness of rivals to abandon or forego aggression depends on their perception of U.S. strength and the vitality of our alliances, end quote. Another quote, we will redouble our commitment to established alliances. And then a third quote,
The NATO alliance of free and sovereign states is one of our great advantages over our competitors, and the United States remains committed to Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. I hope the President reads his own national security strategy. So, Ms. Flournoy, you had mentioned about this 2% metric and that it might not make a lot of sense. So I agree that clearly our NATO allies ought to do more. But one reason the United States does more, that we have a higher percentage of military spending on GDP, is because we are a global superpower that responds to threats all over the world, not just Europe and Russia. Isn't that right?
Right.
Yeah,
I don't
and-
think that 2% is an appropriate standard for the U.S. because we have global responsibilities that other European nations do not.
So in fact, we have bases in Japan and Korea in a way that Belgium does not, right?
Correct.
Now, the metric itself also doesn't make a lot of sense because, for example, Germany could say, hey, we're going to increase our defense spending by giving higher pensions to our military officers. That doesn't somehow help reduce U.S. defense costs, correct?
That's correct. It's also why NATO has said a certain portion of the money needs to be spent on actual capability development and modernization, not just personnel.
Thank you. And it seems like there's also, at least the way the President talks about it, that somehow all these countries should be super grateful that the United States even has some military forces in their countries. I just believe that it's really mutually beneficial to both the U.S. and these other countries. So in fact, in one of the NATO countries, Turkey, for example, it is true, isn't it, that we launch airstrikes from Incirlik Air Base to go after ISIS targets in Syria.
Yes, that's true.
And these NATO countries having our forces there allows us to project force in a way that we otherwise could not. Isn't that right?
Yeah, the forward basing is very much in service of U.S. interests in addition to benefiting NATO.
One of my colleagues asked, well, why did the media also sort of talk about this when the Obama administration made similar statements about NATO? Well, let me just suggest Presidents Obama and Bush never talked about withdrawing from NATO. They did not disparage Article 5 of NATO. They did not beat up on our allies the way that Donald J. Trump has. I previously served on active duty in the United States military. I believe our military is one of the greatest forces in the world. However, we are only stronger when we have our allies working with us. And I think Donald Trump is hurting our national security with his sort of bizarre view of NATO. And it also seems to me that he doesn't quite understand how the funding works with NATO, because whether or not France decides to increase its military spending doesn't mean that somehow U.S. defense spending through appropriations committees makes any difference at all. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for their time. As a former United States ambassador, having served in Western Europe, I understand just how central the NATO alliance is to safeguarding peace and prosperity and security in Europe and around the world. General Lute, I understand that inadequate and unstandardized transportation infrastructure in Europe could make it difficult to move troops and equipment across the continent, curtailing NATO readiness. At the same time, China is seeking to invest billions of euros in infrastructure projects in Eastern Europe as part of its Belt and Road initiative that we've all heard about. How is NATO incorporating China's growing infrastructure footprint into its plan to correct the mobility problem, I'll say, in Eastern Europe?
So it's responding insufficiently. In my opening comments, I made the point that I think NATO needs to pay more attention to these Chinese investments, particularly in transportation and communications infrastructure, because with those commercial investments, they expect a return in terms of political influence. And at the same time, the Chinese investments don't necessarily help the NATO mobility problem and because they're not taking place in the areas we need. We need investment in transportation infrastructure. So we have problems today moving troops from the depth of NATO to the front lines.
Correct.
That's the transportation challenge we need to take on.
And what are we doing in this? And what is the U.S. bringing forward? I'll ask Mr. Brzezinski.
I'd like to raise one important initiative that merits U.S. support, and that's the 3 Cs initiative. It refers to a Central European initiative to accelerate the development of cross-border infrastructure, the 3 Cs being the Baltic Sea, the Adriatic Sea, and the Black Sea. This initiative has received rhetorical support from the administration. It's all about roadways, it's all about highways, it's all about railroads, energy pipelines, and such. And it's interesting to me, the point you made about the Chinese. Both the Chinese and the Russians are trying to pull the Central Europeans away, in part through gaining control over infrastructure.
Right.
The Chinese announced $17 billion commitment to the upcoming Helsinki-Tallinn tunnel. We need to get in that game, and we ought to support the 3 Cs initiative because it would have direct implications for military mobility, because these roads and these highways would enable the alliance to move more directly to its eastern frontiers. We ought to think about how we can financially incentivize Western capital to invest in the 3 Cs projects.
I appreciate that, and thank you for that testimony and for that input. Ms. Flournoy, Russia has increasingly focused on waging hybrid rather than conventional warfare to undermine the West without incurring decisive countermeasures. We have seen this in Russia's cyber attacks on Estonia and other NATO members and in its creation of frozen conflict zones in Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia, I believe, too. How should Russia's reliance on hybrid warfare change the way we think about collective defense?
I think you're right to highlight this because it's one of the areas where NATO is currently weakest and needs to get much stronger, both member states and as an alliance. I think one step in the right direction is some of the cyber infrastructure NATO's put in place with a new center of excellence, an incident response capability, a smart defense initiative on cyber capacity building and so forth. So the alliance is starting to take the kinds of steps we need to see, but that more needs to be done, and it needs to be done more urgently.
To that point, is our recently enhanced forward deployed presence in Poland and the Baltics improving NATO's ability to deter hybrid warfare, would you say?
Yes, I do think that presence is a very important sign of commitment. I think a lot of the capacity building that we do with the Baltic states to make them look like indigestible porcupines to the Russian bear. I mean, those kinds of
indigestible porcupine.
Yeah,
that's exactly the right term.
I think that is very, very important. But I'd like to see our posture in Europe continue to evolve with more emphasis on these infrastructure and transportation issues, more pre-positioning of heavy equipment, and so forth, to really look at what would it take to deter Russia in an actual crisis.
I thank you. I'm out of time. I've got additional questions that I'm going to submit for the record. I appreciate the chairman. Thank you, and you all of your testimony.
Thank you, Ms. Wagner. Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank all the witnesses for coming today and for your testimony. I wanted to ask you a question to begin, Ambassador Lute, about withdrawal from the INF treaty. I think President Trump's withdrawal from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty represents a huge mistake for both America's security and for global peace. I don't think we should accept or be quiet about Russian noncompliance. I think we should redouble our push for full implementation of this and other treaties to keep Russia moving in the right direction on arms control. This move, on the other hand, takes us backward. To make matters worse, the official withdrawal date is August 2nd, and the Trump administration still hasn't laid out a diplomatic plan for how the U.S., together with allies, will pressure Russia to come back into compliance. So my question is whether there's any viable path forward, either to save the treaty or to better ensure that the U.S. and Europe are in lockstep in sustaining arms control with Russia. In other words, what's next here?
Well, Congressman, I think the good news here is that the administration deliberately went to the NATO alliance and secured consensus at 29 for condemning the Russian violation, and apparently the allies are in support of the administration's move to move away from the treaty. I think that the 6-month period between this announcement and August, when we actually withdraw, should feature every diplomatic opportunity, every diplomatic effort to try to cause Russia to come back into compliance so that, in fact, we can preserve the INF Treaty. I say this because the INF Treaty itself is a very stabilizing influence in Europe. That's why we have an INF Treaty, but also because just beyond next August is the renewal of the New START agreement. And I'm concerned that if we take one cornerstone out of the arms control structure, that you begin to erode trust and confidence in the whole structure. So this is not just about INF. I think it could have a carry-on effect.
So how do you prevent an unraveling like that?
Well, I think, first of all, you make every effort to preserve the treaty, hold Russia accountable, and then make sure you do so in alliance with the other 29 members of NATO. I would frankly have not left the treaty. I think our position is stronger and continues to focus on Russia, the violator of the treaty, if we stayed into the treaty. By the way, we have apparently no intent to deploy INF-capable systems ourselves. So we left.
So why walk? It doesn't make any sense to me.
That's my position as well.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask you about another matter. You said in your testimony, you say that so-called hybrid tactics like cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and interference in our democratic process pose the greatest threats to NATO. Would you talk a bit more about why you feel that these sorts of threats pose perhaps even more of a danger than a military threat, say?
Because I think the red lines established for nuclear aggression or conventional force aggression are quite clear and bright. And I think Putin understands that. I think he would prefer to play in the cloudy, ambiguous arena of hybrid warfare, where he complicates attribution of impacts. He uses cyber and these other tools. So it's in that part of the deterrence spectrum, from nuclear, conventional to hybrid, where we need to actually pay the most attention. And candidly, most of the capabilities in the hybrid arena do not count today against the 2% pledge. So there's a disconnect here between what we're requiring allies to do, how much they spend, and what they actually spend it on.
And I guess the question for today's hearing particularly is, do you feel like NATO helps our European partners, and for that matter us, to combat these kind of threats, these hybrid threats?
So the U.S. has been a leader in highlighting cybersecurity in particular to the NATO alliance, but I think there's much more we can do. I mean, and another significant hybrid tactic is interference in our electoral processes. Yes. And now with our 2016 experience here in the United States, we have some experience in what it's like to face that kind of interference. So there's more we can do in this hybrid arena, and that should be a real focus for us. That's where we're vulnerable.
All right, thank you. My time's expired. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Mast.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd take the opportunity to answer a question with a question that was asked a moment ago. Why walk from a treaty? And I think the answer is relatively simple to state, not simple in terms of geopolitics. But if you have a partner in a treaty that is year after year, decade after decade, not being a good partner in that treaty, then that is an answer why you walk from that treaty. And I think that is the answer that President Trump came to as well. Now, I want to speak on a different issue. I'm certainly willing to acknowledge that sometimes caution can be the better part of valor. I would say that the work of a statesman and work of policymakers in the U.S., it shouldn't be conducted by those that are so cautious that they're viewed as scared. I'm very thankful that we don't have a president that is so cautious that he is viewed as scared. And I would say that NATO will better enable itself to address today's challenges if, in fact, it does shake itself to the core. Ms. Flournoy, you said that NATO, in some of your remarks, is being shaken to its core. I think NATO is better off being shaken to its core for a number of reasons. The Soviet Union no longer exists. Russia is not the Soviet Union. It is still a massive threat, but it is not the Soviet Union. China is different today in 2019 than it was in 1989 and 1969. And China is not the Soviet Union. The attack of today, it's different. It's a cyber attack, it's a currency attack, it's financial markets, it's trade. China is not acting yet today in the same kind of global military that the Soviet Union was. They do certainly act as a global cyber threat. They are trading with all. China is trading with all. They are not isolating themselves from all in the West. China, you know, they're not yet exporting communism. My friend and I, Mr. Yoho, were speaking about this yesterday. China's not yet exporting communism, but they're certainly spreading their own brand of Chinese socialism around the world. So I believe that NATO, in order to enable itself for the future, they should shake themselves down to the core. They need to shake off the rust. I think they probably should have done this after Germany was reunited many years ago. They failed to do it at that time. They probably should have done it at that time. So I want to ask in that line to any of you, and probably certainly to you, sir, how do you suggest that we shake that rust off to ensure that NATO has strength through its relevancy to the current threats, both beyond conventional military that exists today that are different? They're different types of direct attacks. How do we shake NATO to its core to recognize that a cyber attack on one is a cyber attack on all, and get that kind of recognition so that we go out there and attack in the same way that we would expect through conventional military forces coming against us? And to go beyond that, can you give an estimate of costs, as we constantly speak about the 2%, give an estimate of costs that are associated with a robust cyber defense as an alliance, as well as having that ability to have a robust cyber attack ability as a NATO alliance? What is the difference in costs that are associated either up or down related to that? Sir.
Sir, I can't give you an answer on cyber costs. It's just out of my area of expertise. But your point about shaking up the alliance, I have great degree of discomfort with much of the president's rhetoric. It can be divisive in an unhelpful way. It can communicate a lack of commitment that is not healthy to the alliance and maybe even animate some of the aspirations of the likes of Putin. But he has brought in, with almost like a sledgehammer, a long-standing concern that has been bipartisan, been shared by multiple administrations over the lack of or the inability or lack of willingness of our allies to spend the money they need to do in order to meet their, not just their 2%, because it's not just 2%, it's their commitment to be ready to live up to the responsibilities they have in the execution of Article 5. And when the president hits them hard on that, it does shake them up. I think when you have hearings like this, I think when the alliance has public reports that report on the readiness of allied forces, that helps shake them up. You know, when I think about the German move to higher levels of defense spending, it's true they're not yet committed to 2% fully, even though they say they've done it through the Wales summit, but they haven't put aside NATO a plan on how to get there. The fact is they're making progress. Part of it's from U.S. direct pressure. Part of it is from looking east and seeing what's happening. And part of it is because of news reports and parliamentary inquiries into the embarrassing state of readiness of the German military. When you have exercises being conducted with broomsticks as opposed to rifles and tanks, German taxpayers don't like to see that. They're uncomfortable with it. It's a pride issue. So the more the alliance can do, the more you can do to dig into and bring out the facts and figures about the readiness of our allies and relate that readiness to the kind of the contingency plans we're planning for, will help shake up the alliance in the way you wish.
My time has long expired. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you. Ms. Spanberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses today. In an article last year, the Atlantic Council highlighted not only the defense and security benefits of NATO, but also the economic importance of the alliance in securing and protecting European economies and incentivizing European acquisition of U.S. military equipment and platforms. And in a recent Congressional Research Service report, they added the point of information that the EU, of which 22 member states are also NATO allies, the EU is the United States' largest trading and investment partner. And through the promotion of security and stability in Europe, NATO protects this extensive economic partnership that accounts for 46% of global GDP. So my question for you all today is, what are the economic impacts of the NATO alliance, and are there benefits, and if so, could you speak to them, to the U.S. economy and our own trade relationships that are tied to the existence and the continued strength of NATO?
I'll take a quick shot at that. NATO provides a transatlantic security architecture that over the last 70 years has provided for peace among its members and defended them against external aggression. And I would say that is a core criteria for robust and sustained economic growth. And that is how NATO contributes to the economic well-being of the transatlantic community.
I would only add that, first, I agree with your data. I mean, 46% of the world GDP, if you combine the United States and our European allies, is a substantial weight, which is useful on our side if we're going to compete with China. So I think that's obvious. And then very much agree with Ian's point that the security architecture that secures that 50% of world GDP is NATO. So this is simply a matter of securing our investments.
And just to build on that, when we talk about a Europe whole, free, and at peace, it's often thought of in a political context. But of course, one of the great triumphs of the post-Cold War era has been the economic dynamism and growth of Europe. That's helped Europe a lot, which is why all of us have concerns about Europe's lack of spending on defense, because Europeans are more able to spend on their defense than they were 25 years ago. But that's also a huge benefit to the United States. Europe's success also can equal American success.
I would just add, in addition to modernizing and adapting NATO for the future, the most important thing we could do to shore up the transatlantic community, for all the reasons you described, is to negotiate a free trade agreement with the EU. That would give us tremendous leverage vis-a-vis China and tremendous additional prosperity for Americans here at home.
Thank you very much. And to build upon the answers that you just provided and the prior line of questioning from my colleague from Florida, we're speaking a lot about moving into the future, but he referenced the fall of the Soviet Union. He referenced the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I'm curious if you could comment on what impact you think the stabilization and strength that was provided to Europe as a whole, to the United States and our relationship with our fellow NATO countries, were in fact how the strength of NATO perhaps played into those changes that we saw shifting with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of communism.
Well, I think the image, the aspiration to join the alliance, but also to join the EU, was a great motivation for these newly freed former Warsaw Treaty members and also some Soviet republics, the Baltics, for example. So it created for them an incentive to move towards. And when the wall came down, the Soviet Union broke apart, they voted with their feet. They were now free to make a choice, and they voted to join NATO, and they voted to join the EU. So it's been a real inspiration and an incentive. And I think it remains that way today, which is why a number of us have highlighted the importance of sustaining the open door policy, because it continues to serve as an incentive for the kind of political, economic, and military reforms that we favor.
Thank you so much for your comments on this topic related to the economic strength that NATO brings, or stabilization that NATO allows for the economic growth for the United States and also NATO member countries. I appreciate your time today. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Pence.
Thank you, Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, and the witnesses for being here today. I am a strong supporter of NATO and believe our shared security interests are and should remain a feature of the transatlantic relationship. I will continue to support the President and his administration in strengthening NATO. As you know, since the late 1990s, the EU has been working with limited success to form a unified European defense policy complete with independent EU defense capabilities. These efforts appear to have gained momentum in the past year or two. I want to rattle off a series of questions which are really basically the same. If you could each answer these. What is your assessment of these efforts? Could the development of a more robust and independent EU defense capability benefit NATO and the United States? And is there a risk that EU efforts could undermine NATO's effectiveness and diminish its capabilities?
Congressman, I think that the intensification of this discussion within the EU on an independent defense capability is in part a result of the greater uncertainty they feel about the U.S. commitment to NATO. That said, I think if EU defense efforts spurs additional European defense spending, we should count that as a plus. What worries me is if the EU were to develop a sort of a view of strategic autonomy that would sort of go its own, have Europe go its own way without really coordinating with, working closely with the United States and addressing shared challenges. I think that would be a loss for us and for our security.
Congressman, I concur with that. I think on the one hand, discussions within Europe, which are only increasing about developing some sort of independent capability, is a reflection of uncertainty about the U.S. and hedging about U.S. behavior, but it's also a response to inquiries by all of us to urge them to spend more on their defense. And it's also a recognition that, and I think this part is positive, that there are going to be things they do in the world where the U.S. is not going to do that. For example, in West Africa, where the U.S. may not be as engaged as France and other EU partners. I think it's important, though, as they embark on this. This is not a new story. 20 years ago, we were also dealing with Europeans talking about developing a more independent defense capability. Three rules to keep in mind, or three principles. The 3 Ds, the Secretary of State, then Secretary of State Albright enunciated. No duplication between what the EU is going to do and what NATO is going to do to make sure this is complementary. No discrimination, so making sure that as Europe develops this capability, they're not discriminating against those few countries that are members of the EU but not of NATO, or vice versa. And no duplication. So, and no decoupling, meaning that this is not about Europe separating itself from the United States fully so it can go on its own. I think as long as we keep in mind those core principles, we should be supportive of Europe trying to make itself stronger on defense.
Congressman, I think we can't have it both ways. We can't, on the one hand, say you must do more, and then when the EU comes up with incentive programs or ways to create efficiencies among EU members, then we critique those as well. So I would err on the side of applauding EU initiatives to try to generate capabilities. I very much agree with no duplication and so forth. But quite candidly, in my view, we are decades away from being in a position where we have to actually compare EU capabilities to NATO capabilities and worry about duplication. They have a long way to go.
Sir, I'll just add that on the duplication point, my concern is that there is a drive to create an independent command structure that would be duplicative of NATO. That's what the French are driving. That would be unhelpful. And when we look back at the history of EU defense initiatives, it hasn't been that impressive. They've created battle groups. They've never been used. They have talked about being a driver of increased defense spending. I haven't really seen any evidence that the EU has been an effective driver of defense spending. But if they're willing to talk about leveraging the EU and its economic capacities to increase the capacity to invest and the development of technologies and capabilities and capacities for defense operations, then I'm kind of interested. And I'd make these recommendations to the EU. One, I would focus less on autonomy and more on the European pillar. When we talk about the European pillar, we're talking about European capability within the transatlantic framework. I would urge them, through projects like the European Defense Fund that are standing up, a $13 billion fund, and the PESCO initiative, to focus on things that are substantive, that are real NATO shortfalls. It would be far more useful if we could see the EU be a driver of increased air and missile defense capabilities within our European armed forces. More airlift, more air refueling capability, more in air and missile defense. if these EU initiatives were used to drive forward those capabilities, I'd be highly, highly supportive. And then I would note that there's one area where they're actually potentially on the cusp of doing something useful. The EU will be directing, in its next big 7-year budget, 6.5 billion euros to help improve military mobility. That is, investing in the infrastructure, the roadways and the highways and the airports and the ports that will help facilitate the more ready movement of heavy equipment for military operations. That kind of infrastructure investment is something that the EU is perfectly positioned to do, and I encourage you to encourage them to move with dispatch on that.
Thank you. Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start with you, Ms. Flournoy. Back to the 2% of GDP target. Now, that is the whole point of that target is to get our allies to invest more in their actual military capabilities so that they can partner with us. If they spent that money on uniforms or increased salaries for their troops, it would defeat the whole purpose of the 2%. Is that a fair
Yes, that's correct.
assessment? If we were to demand that NATO allies pay us billions of dollars for the so-called privilege of being allowed to base our forces overseas, that presumably could count against their 2%, but it would not be investing money in their own defense capabilities. Is that a fair statement?
And, I think the truth is our allies already do defray much of, a substantial portion of the costs of our basing overseas. It varies from country to country, but those are negotiated agreements. But we are there for our own interests. Our real interest on the 2% is to ensure that money is going into the capabilities we will need for the future, be it high-end military readiness and capabilities or capabilities for the gray zone that Ambassador Lute talked about.
Exactly, and they would have less money to invest in those capabilities if we were somehow to force them to spend billions for hosting Africa.
And I also don't think they would accept that deal. I think we would be invited to bring all of our forces home, which would be both detrimental to our security and very, very costly to the American taxpayer.
Exactly. So would we save any money if we brought our forces home where we pay 100%?
No, it's generally, in most cases, it will be far more expensive to bring those forces home and rebase them in the United States.
Thank you. Mr. Lute, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about Afghanistan. A number of us, and you've heard this, I'm sure, from our colleagues, were in Munich. We had an opportunity to engage with our allies on these decisions, potentially to withdraw from Syria and from Afghanistan. We are all very keenly aware of the anxiety that this has caused our allies who have been with us all the way in these deployments. They have no idea what we plan to do. Let me ask you about one particular angle related to Afghanistan. If we were to follow through on the publicly stated plan to withdraw our regular forces from Afghanistan, assuming that there are still terrorists in Afghanistan's future, al-Qaeda or ISIS, is it fair to assume that we would still have special forces units operating in Afghanistan?
I'm sorry, that's the topic of the ongoing negotiations led by Ambassador Khalilzad. So how is it that we could, by way of this negotiation with the Taliban, and eventually the Taliban with the Afghan government, buy some assurances that the Taliban pledge that they won't allow ISIS or al-Qaeda is actually enforced? So the nature of this enforcement mechanism is exactly what Ambassador Khalilzad is working on.
Yeah, I'm just trying to bear down on what realistically will happen, because the American people are being told we're leaving. And my expectation is we will still have special forces operating in Afghanistan. We may not talk about it so much. We will still have CIA bases, as we currently do in Afghanistan, in the hinterlands. We may not talk about it as much. And if I'm right about that, then the result of the withdrawal will be that we will still be in Afghanistan, but instead of partnering with our allies, instead of partnering with an elected Afghan government that has some legitimacy, we will be partnering with warlords who are raping little boys and girls and doing things that actually will make the long-term mission harder to achieve. bottom line, we will still be in Afghanistan. So is this really an honest conversation that we're having?
So it's very hard for me to comment on negotiations that I'm not participating in, but I know for sure that this question of how you sustain a Taliban pledge and how you enforce it if we were to withdraw, how it's actually done in practice. And so,
right.
We're talking about conjecture.
In a future, but in a future in which there's still al-Qaeda and ISIS there, pledge or no pledge, we would not ignore that.
I think we have to assume that al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in that region would have some residual presence, and we need to buy some insurance against that.
Okay. Anybody else thoughts on that?
I would just say, although I'm not privy to the negotiations either, your assumptions are reasonable about what sort of presence we would seek to keep in Afghanistan, given the threats that I think we all agree will remain there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, panelists. Appreciate you being here and going through this long hearing. We're at 70 years of NATO, and it's been good. There's not been another world war since NATO. Here we are 70 years later, yet the world is going through a challenge in world powers we haven't seen since World War II. And a big part of that reason we haven't is again, because of NATO. It's been effective in that. But things are changing. And if you look back, I'm 64, and I changed a lot in the last 64 years. And so things get stale after a while, and they have to be updated. And, I think, the testimonies we've heard today, the comments, whether NATO's paying their fair share or not, I mean, it's been hashed over and over again. President Obama said that, President Bush said that people are taking advantage of us or free riding. At what point, and Ms. Flournoy, you said that this is not the time to nickel and dime NATO. When would be the time? Do we wait another 3 to 5 years? Keep in mind we're at $22 trillion in debt. 5 years, we're going to be about $30 trillion in debt. Our interest that we owe at that time will be equal to what we're spending on our military. So when do we get other people to pay and pony up?
I think we should continue to press for our NATO allies to pay their fair share. But my focus would be on what else are they doing to shore up deterrence against Russia? What else are they doing to contribute to counterterrorism globally? What else are they doing to help us build gray zones?
Can we wait another 5 years before people do that?
No, and we're not, and we shouldn't, and no administration in recent memory has waited. They've all pressed.
And as we look at the results, it was interesting. I went to the Cleveland convention when it was candidate Trump going into the convention, and I spoke to a group of ambassadors from around the world on energy, and it was interesting because there was a reception after that. They came up to me. I had my wife with me and our deputy chief of staff, and they says, we want to introduce ourselves. We're members of NATO, but we haven't been good members. And this is when President Trump, candidate Trump, was talking about NATO's not paying their fair share. This is what happened. They told me they've been bad members, but they were looking to increase their payment to 2%, as was the pledge, in addition to pull up the arrears that they owed. So the rhetoric that he spoke, whether you like this tactic or not, the results, I think we're all in agreement, was pretty effective. And, people aren't used to that kind of rhetoric. We could say things better, maybe, but I'd rather look at the results and get the positive results because it does get people to pay attention and kind of reorganize what NATO, and I think what my colleague, Mr. Mass, brought up, we need to update this into the 21st century for the cyber attacks. I mean, I just read today that China is hacking into our naval intelligence and our construction and all the new weapons that we're creating. Is that an attack on us? And when do we all come together collectively to do that? And Mr. Brzezinski, you were talking about Putin thrives on weakness and decisiveness. Hence Georgia, hence Crimea. They walk into, they take over. We see that the freedom of navigations aren't happening in the Azov Sea or the Baltic Seas. And so Putin, as Xi Jinping, sees weakness, so they aggress. Xi Jinping in the South China Sea. Putin is going to aggress unless we stand up definitively as a bloc. And if they know we've been ineffective, that members are kind of stale, yeah, we're in this NATO thing, but we don't really have to pay. it just shows weakness. And I think that's one of the reasons Putin did what he did. Am I wrong in that?
Yes, sir. No, sir, not wrong in that.
I was hoping you'd say no.
Just a quote on burden sharing, and talking about decades. My favorite quote goes back to 1953 when Secretary of State John Foster Dulles threatened, quote unquote, an agonizing reappraisal of the U.S. commitment to European security if its allies do not step up. I think it's interesting. It shows how long a debate we've had on this, but at least we're making progress.
You know, and that's a great point, because that's come up over and over and through my notes I read. It's come up over and over again. I mean, some of this goes back, says 2 decades ago they were talking about this.
It's time for
I was going to say, well, damn it, when do you stand up and do it? But I shouldn't say that. So, dang it, when do you stand up and do something? And I'm thankful this president had the backbone, you know, and he'll admit, I'm not your typical politician, but he's looking for the results. And I think we should applaud the results he's getting to get people to come forward, because it makes us all collectively stronger. I mean, would you agree in that?
I think that we should applaud the burden sharing results, but the other result has been this sort of existential doubt that's been created on the part, in the minds of our allies about whether they can count on the U.S. That is also a result of the same rhetoric. So there's been positive, but there's also been a negative, and we need to take account of that as well.
All right, well, you go back to the criticism of NATO burden sharing have been articulated by both Republican and Democratic presidents. And you go on, and it says, I think you wrote this, it was Secretary Gates's. It said, President Obama called a number of American allies free riders towards the end of the administration. Also, Secretary Robert Gates did a hard line against NATO's inability to share more of the burden during the farewell speech. The blunt reality is there has been a dwindling appetite, patience, and it goes on. And the end result is the general now, Stoltenberg, also said that President Trump is helping us adapt the alliance and has made these people pay up. So I think the results are good. Let's look forward and what we're going to do on the cybersecurity, and I'm way over. Sorry, Mr. Chairman and members.
Thank you. Mr. Trone.
Thank you all for coming here today. My first question, let's go back to Turkey again. The case right now, they're working to look at buying the Russian defense, the S-400. They've already ordered, we haven't delivered yet, the F-35. It's unacceptable that they buy the system and have the F-35. What's the response that Congress should have? What can we do here to make that crystal clear that we can't go down this road? Ms. Flourney?
Well, I think as you review foreign military sales, I think you will have your opportunity to send signals to Turkey. But I would encourage delegations to go visit and to talk to their Turkish the Turkish president, his administration, other members of parliament there, to let them know that this will really complicate our ability to provide the kind of U.S. defense capabilities that they'd like to have as part of the alliance. And I think that the backsliding on democracy needs to be a part of the conversation. We have not been raising that issue enough with our Turkish counterparts. We need to press them on this issue. We need to connect what goes on in that sphere with what the degree to which we can cooperate in the security sphere.
There's no question. I think we need to connect that plus the democracy and the Kurds and the treatment we've had there and the potential for more atrocities in the Kurds as we pull out of Syria.
Absolutely.
Is there any point at all that you have to reconsider them being part of NATO? We're going to reach that point at some point?
So if I may, so unlike the EU treaty, which has provisions for sanctioning member states who drift from core values, the NATO treaty has no similar provision. In fact, the only thing that the Washington Treaty says is that if you wish to leave NATO, you've got to give 1 year's notice. I think there are ways that we could pressure Mr. Erdogan and his political elite to come back into line, closer into line with U.S. interests, for example, the S-400 and F-35 debate, but also to underline Michelle Flournoy's point about values. They need to understand that there's no NATO ally today which has slipped further from the founding values of the alliance than Mr. Erdogan's Turkey. And that's simply unacceptable.
Agreed. The Baltics, lots of hybrid warfare there, cyber capabilities happening through the small Baltic states. Is this an area where these small NATO partners are innovating in any way that we can learn, and that would be an advantage to us as we look to more problems with cyber and hybrid warfare from Russia down the road?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the Baltics, they're on the cutting edge when it comes down to combating hybrid warfare. There's a reason why NATO has a cyber center of excellence in Estonia, because they've been most forward-leaning. They're the ones who experienced the first kind of nationwide cyber attack in 2007. So they're thinking in very innovative ways how to deal with cyber attacks. You go to Lithuania, they have one of the more sophisticated public response teams to deal with social media attacks. For example, when a NATO unit was deployed over there, there was false accusations made of a rape conducted by NATO soldiers. They, in real time, responded to dissipate the impact of that story. So there are many lessons we can learn from our Baltic allies.
And if I could just add, what NATO is doing in the Baltics today is a great example of the distributed responsibility that the alliance can bring. This isn't a U.S.-only effort in the Baltics to try to defend the Baltics and bolster them. This is something where there are 4 battalion-sized battle groups there, one led by the U.S., one led by the Brits, one led by the Canadians, and one led by the Germans. So this is an example of how a strong alliance of capable allies, willing to step up and lead, can share the responsibility for the common good.
I just cite another dimension of this, and this is an effort to break the energy dependence that the Baltic states have on Russia. So most important there is the example of a recently opened LNG terminal in Lithuania, which now opens them up to the potential of importing LNG, energy, gas from the world marketplace and not be wholly reliant on their ties to Russia.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Watkins, is
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks to the panel for being here. I'd like to talk about the Arctic. Questions are open to anybody. Obviously, the Arctic has geopolitical ramifications. What's the NATO strategy with regard to the Arctic?
It's very light on strategy, Congressman. I would say that there has been, especially with regard to the climate impacts in the Arctic and the potential that a sort of a northern tier transit route from China into the Atlantic becomes more and more a possibility over the coming years, that NATO is paying more attention here. I'd also highlight the Arctic, though, as an example of engaging with Russia, even though we have, the hearing has suggested many ways in which we compete with Russia. Right? One effective way to engage with Russia is exemplified by the Arctic Council. I think that's the correct name, which brings together the 7 Arctic nations to include other NATO allies with Russia to discuss about the climate, but also security implications in the far north. So this is becoming more important, and climate here intersects NATO strategy.
Thank you. And I know we talked a lot about China today, but would NATO describe China as a threat to transatlantic security?
Not today, and not, I think, in the foreseeable future. But NATO needs to wake up to China as a competitor, and in particular in the commercial investment space, transportation and information systems, and increasingly in the political space. They tend to buy their way into influence on the commercial side and then expect political payoff.
If I could add on that, I mean, NATO does have a foundation to work with when it comes down to dealing with China. Over the last decade, it's developed partnerships with countries like Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. This provides a foundation upon which to kind of deepen a more elaborate, a more substantive set of engagements in the region. It's something the United States should be encouraging NATO to do as we try to develop a more comprehensive strategy to dealing with an increasingly assertive China. And I think if we make the case to our Europeans, we'll find them somewhat more receptive than before, because they're beginning to feel the pressure from China themselves in the economic and the cyber domains.
The other thing I would just add, sir, is that I think China watches U.S. behavior very carefully globally, and that includes how we interact with our allies. So if there are troubles or tensions with our NATO allies, it often makes our Asian allies very nervous as well, and China looks for ways to divide and exploit that.
Well, let me ask about that. Then what strategy, and if not strategy, roles, responsibilities do NATO have with regards to North Korea?
Other than these partnerships that Mr. Brzezinski mentioned, none.
But I think it's politically, the NATO allies become very, very important allies to stand with us politically, to press for the objective of denuclearization and to make sure that North Korean provocative behavior is deterred, if not answered. So I agree, there's no military role, but politically they can be very important.
Sure. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Allred, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our distinguished panel for being here today. I am of the opinion that NATO is the most successful human alliance in history, and that with this being the 70th anniversary of this historic alliance, I want to make sure that we are doing everything we can in Congress to be a counterweight to some of what we've seen from, obviously, our president. And I just want to talk to you a little bit about, I try to drill things down for folks in my district, folks in Texas, I represent parts of Dallas, what the impact of our foreign affairs and our foreign policy has on us at home. And obviously NATO's ability for us to maintain kind of this era of post-World War II peace has been critical in that. But Ms. Flournoy, if you could just talk a little bit about our trade with that NATO empowers and enables, how that interaction with our allies is good for our economy, and how this is really a critical relationship for us across more than just some of the things that might be people be more aware of.
So NATO has provided the foundation of stability on which the transatlantic economic relationships have been built. More than $1 trillion of trade in goods and services between the U.S. and Europe every year. That accounts for a significant percentage of our GDP. It also accounts for a number of export-related jobs in the United States. I don't have the figures for your district in Texas, but I guarantee you there are some jobs in your district that are dependent on our trade with the Europeans. So it's really, that trade relationship is an engine for the economies on both sides of the Atlantic. And as we all have said before, as a matter of strategy, it would be very beneficial for the United States to leverage that in pushing back on China when we talk about its unfair trade practices or its theft of IP or its denial of our market access. We are much stronger when we push back together with our European Asian allies than when we do it by ourselves.
Absolutely. I agree with you. The rules-based order that NATO and our transatlantic alliances have allowed us to enforce, I think we underestimate its importance for our economy. We had Secretary Albright in here recently, and in addition to being just an incredible person, she said that this was Article 1 time, and that it was time for the Congress to reassert itself in our foreign policy. And I would just ask each of you, if you could, to touch a little bit. I'm sure you've been asked this previously here in the hearing about what you think Congress can do, what we can do, and I can do individually as a member, and what we can do as a body to make sure that our allies understand our commitment. We obviously had a vote a couple weeks ago that was overwhelmingly bipartisan, showing our support for NATO. But what can we do to make sure that the rest of the world understands that we are committed to this alliance and that we're not going to let us backtrack?
So 3 quick things, Congressman. First of all, the NATO Support Act is a big step in the right direction. And, it may seem like something that doesn't sort of have an impact outside of Capitol Hill. Our NATO allies read that and appreciate it. So that's step number one. Step number two is fully fund the European Defense Initiative, which promotes the kind of work that we've talked about here this morning. Step number three, I think Congress needs to go one step further, and that is to pursue bipartisan legislation that prohibits the president from unilaterally withdrawing from our most important alliance. And as I said in my opening statement, it took 2/3 of the Senate under advice and consent, a constitutional requirement, to approve the NATO treaty. Should not simply be an executive move to depart.
Congressman, if I could just add, I concur with those 3 points, and the fourth, which has come up several times so far this morning, which is having you all engage directly. The incredible show of support by the size of the delegation in Munich was widely noticed throughout Europe. There's going to be another opportunity, obviously, in less than a month when the Secretary General of NATO comes to speak before a joint session of Congress, and also many NATO ministers will be here in Washington, and I know will be anxious to interact and hear from all of you about your views, not just on the U.S. role in the alliance and the importance of U.S. leadership, but also ways the alliance needs to get sharper and needs to reform, and I think that's an important message that comes from Congress as well.
Thank you. And before I call on Mr. Zeldin, I just, Mr. Cholet, to your point, we had the largest delegation in living memory, both at the Munich Security Conference. I think there were 55 of us there, and at the opening session of the Parliamentary Assembly and the NATO, North Atlantic Assembly meetings in Brussels. It was also the first time ever a Speaker of the House attended both meetings, which having the third-ranking member of the United States government there to reinforce. And then, as you know, subsequently we have invited Secretary General Stoltenberg, who I believe may be the first Secretary General of NATO, ever to be invited to address a joint session of the Congress. So I think we are making statements, and we certainly, I think, will follow up legislatively, Mr. Lute, on what you cited as well. But I think on a bipartisan basis, Senate and House statements could not be clearer in terms of where we are in our support for this alliance. And with that, I call on the gentleman from New York, Mr. Zeldin.
Well, thank you. And as someone who was also at the Munich Security Conference, I would echo Mr. Connolly's point. I believe that it was important to have such a strong bipartisan showing there. And the support for this alliance should not just remain strong, but as Mr. Chalet just pointed out, we need to find ways to make it even stronger. I wanted to talk briefly about Turkey and Syria, but as two different topics. Can we go a little bit more into detail? I believe, Mr. Lute, you started to get into it as you were discussing with Mr. Trone. The dynamics of Turkey purchasing an S-400 surface-to-air missile from Russia, purchasing F-35s from the United States. I believe the S-400 acquisition would be made by Turkey before the F-35s are scheduled to be delivered. If you could just, and I would hate to see that S-400 operating in that particular airspace, whether it's our F-35s or anything else as far as the United States military and our allies go. So can you just get, and the question's open to all four of you, if you could talk a little bit more about what this means and why this is problematic.
So the original challenge here is the Turkish decision to buy the S-400. That's important because that Russian-based system will never be integrated into the overall air and missile defense system in NATO. And we'll simply block that integration because integrating the Russian system would open vulnerabilities to the whole NATO integrated system. So Turkey is essentially spending money to buy a national-only system, which from the outset they've been told will never be integrated. So it's a very sort of selfish nationalist sort of decision, which is short-sighted and will never be used. It will never contribute to NATO. It's further complicated if we were to proceed with an F-35 purchase, because now you'd have under one national command structure the premier Russian-built air defense system against our premier aircraft. And you can imagine that we would never be certain enough to ensure that these didn't game one against the other and open up vulnerabilities for the rest of the F-35 fleet. So this is a two-part story, and they're both bad news.
Anybody like to add anything?
If I could just add, just complicating this further on the F-35 side, my understanding is part of the Turkish purchase of F-35 involves some co-production, so which means part of the plane would actually be built in Turkey. And so I know that our EUCOM commanders are talking through with the Turks about how that in itself would be extremely problematic, let alone them acquiring, but then producing the F-35 at the same time they've also are trying to stand up a Russian system on their own territory will, I think, make it even harder to see how that would go forward. What I can say is my sense is this administration, really actually going back 2 administrations now as this has been on the table, it's been very consistent and very clear with the Turkish government about the mistake we believe this would be and the fact that it will jeopardize other elements of our military partnership with them.
And it seems like there's some kind of a game of chicken going on here between Turkey and the United States to see who blinks first, and I think the United States needs to remain resolute in insisting that if Turkey wants to acquire F-35s, that they are not going to be able to proceed with their S-400s. Either of the other 2 witnesses want to add anything else on this topic? Shifting gears to Syria, at the Munich Security Conference, there was a discussion of what our European partners thought about taking on a bigger role in Syria. I would like you, if any of you could comment on what that would look like from a NATO standpoint, please.
I don't foresee NATO taking on a much larger role because I don't think there's consensus across the alliance for that. But we have had key allies individually step up, sort of relying on the backbone of U.S. Special Operations Forces and our enablers and our command and control to contribute, as whether it's as trainers or in reconstruction or in ISR overhead or combat air missions. I think if the U.S. were to withdraw or sharply reduce our presence, the backbone that they rely on those capabilities wouldn't be there, and you would see a commensurate reduction, if not complete withdrawal of our European allies. So I do think the U.S. posture is critical as kind of the linchpin to the coalition posture against ISIL.
And real briefly, we're running out of time.
Add to that, I agree with what Michelle has said. It's also a little bit of issue in getting cart before the horse. You're not going to get NATO
Mr.
involved.
Brzezinski, if you could speak into the mic. Thank you.
Thank you. You're not going to get NATO involved in Syria until there's a real clear path towards peace and stability and reconciliation in that war-torn country. So when thinking about NATO and Syria, I would look at the example set by NATO in Afghanistan, where an ally went in with some other allies and took control of the country. And when things reach a certain point with a certain degree of confidence that an alliance contribution would be part of a coherent strategy towards peace and reconciliation in the country, then the alliance will be more prepared. And actually, I'd say those are the circumstances under which we'd want the alliance to get engaged.
My time's expired. I'm yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Connolly.
Thank you. And just another footnote, Mr. Lute, the resolution denying the president unilateral authority to pull out of the agreement is actually HJ Res 41 here in the House, and that was introduced by Mr. Gallego and myself. And we have a companion bill in the Senate introduced by Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia. So we will work on that. And with the help of the chairman, we'll get it before our committee. I want to follow up a little bit on Turkey, too. And Mr. Lute, you kind of, I think you said something that I would call provocative, not necessarily bad, but here's a NATO ally, one of the staunchest historically, and yet they seem to be testing almost everything. They seem to be testing the common values that presumably unite NATO members, not just what we're against, but what we're for, what we stand for. They're challenging us with respect to the Kurds, who are the only group that consistently, successfully fought by our side and won territory from the ISIS. And yet, the Turks would have you believe that all of those Kurdish fighters in Syria are, in fact, terrorists or affiliated with terrorists. And we need to force them to give up territory they won with their own blood and our support, and create some kind of cordon sanitaire, I guess, between Syrian and Turkish border that presumably would be patrolled by the Turks. One does not know what the fate of the Kurds would be in that set of circumstances. Purchasing Russian equipment almost in defiance, maybe not almost, maybe in defiance of any kind of norm in terms of standard setting by NATO, crackdown on freedom of press, crackdown on opposition, on and on, using the coup maybe as a pretext to do all of that. What is one to conclude? And what do you think ought to happen? Because there are other NATO members that are sliding too. Hungary and Poland come to mind. And it seems to me we have to have a coherent message, or we become this disparate group of 28 or 29 members that the only thing we have in common is, I guess, resisting Russian aggression in Central Europe.
Congressman, I couldn't agree more. I think the values that are in the second sentence of the Washington Treaty, well before you get to Article 5, you pass through the values, right? And that was agreed by all 29. So I think it's right for us, both within the alliance, largely led by the Secretary General, to have quiet diplomatic engagement with Turkish leaders about what they're placing at risk with their behavior. I also think, though, there's some introspection here for us. I mean, we have no U.S. ambassador in Turkey. We have a vacancy in the European Bureau of the State Department. Who will do this engagement with Turkey if we have only people in acting positions? So we have to sort of vote with our own time and space and get senior level diplomats in place and then engage relentlessly with the Erdogan regime. But they're headed in the wrong direction.
Mr. Scholler, you're shaking your head yes.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, Turkey is, as Ambassador Lute said, the one member of NATO that has gone the furthest, the fastest in terms of its democratic backslide. And that is only going to be a continuing irritant in the alliance. And in fact, as you suggest, Congressman, could undermine the second sentence of the preamble of the Washington Treaty, which is all about democratic values. And we are not, frankly, in a good position right now to address this issue and deal with the Turkish government on this issue. So beyond the military challenges we have, which are significant with them, with the acquisition of the Russian system, these political challenges, of which NATO has an important role to play, are going to be paramount.
I want to give Ms. Flournoy and Mr. Brzezinski an opportunity also to comment. And it's primarily about Turkey, but it also, feel free to include, our concerns about Hungary and Poland. And then I would go back with the indulgence of the chair.
I agree with what my colleagues have said. I just think that one of the things that's gone missing in our diplomacy is an emphasis on democracy and human rights and the protection of minority rights. It is so much about who we are as a nation. It is so much about who we are as an alliance that has to be part of the hard conversation we have with allies who demonstrate some degree of backsliding. You can't have it both ways. You can't be a member in good standing in an alliance that was formed to protect democracy and be in the process of obliterating democracy in your own country.
With my colleagues, I'll just add, it's interesting to me, the forward edge of the Russian sword is social media and hybrid attacks designed to undercut the commonality of values we have in the alliance as binding it. By attacking those values and by attacking the unity around those values, our adversaries are trying to actually weaken one of our strongest assets, which is the NATO alliance.
Thank you very much. Ms. Titus.
Well, thank you. Just to follow up, when you talk about Turkey, you also, nobody's mentioned the relationship with Greece and what's happening in Cyprus. Those are kind of sidelines to the main event, I guess. Also, I would say it's very difficult for us to take some of the members to task when we set such a bad example ourselves. And I go back to the comments you made. You know, we heard a lot of praise for the president being tough and getting the NATO countries to pay more of their share. But Ambassador Lute, you said that our single greatest challenge is the lack of real leadership. Now, I just want to put on the record the tweets, and I will use their word, the President's words, not just my paraphrasing of them. In July 2018, he said, "While I had a great meeting with NATO raising vast amounts of money, I had an even better meeting with Vladimir Putin of Russia. Sadly, it's not being reported that way. The fake news is going crazy." Then he followed up and said, "While the NATO meeting in Brussels was an acknowledged triumph with billions of dollars more put up by member countries, the meeting with Russia may prove to be, in the long run, an even greater success. Many positive things will come out of that meeting." So what are our fellow members of the alliance supposed to think? Do as I say, or do as I do, or you do something different from the message that we're putting out? I can understand your frustration, and I share it. I'd like to talk about the contribution they make besides arms and besides dollars when you look at the countries of NATO. I serve on the House Democracy Partnership, and we meet with a lot of new democracies trying to have exchanges between legislatures to build up democratic institutions, whether it's parties, whether it's the media, whether it's the courts and the rule of law. You mentioned Ukraine and Georgia. Those are two partners. Would you just talk about how being part of NATO helps to either create, build up, or strengthen democratic institutions? Because I think that is one of our greatest successes, potentially.
I'll say just a few words and then hand it off. When we went through the first round of NATO expansion, we had the Perry principles from Secretary Perry, and there were certain criteria that we laid out for NATO aspirants. One of them was you have to be a functioning democracy that protects minority rights. You had to be a free market economy. You had to meet certain milestones in terms of interoperability and your military capabilities and so forth. But democracy has always been, whether it's at the founding of the alliance or the expansion of the alliance, it's always been a key criteria, and I'll defer to others to add.
I agree with that, and I think that's further is a further reason for why enlargement and the open door policy of enlargement has been so important, and I think remains so important, because NATO serves as a kind of a magnet, an incentive system for countries to make, those transitioning countries, those in the post-Soviet space, post-communist countries, to make the kinds of decisions in terms of their political system, and also the way that the role their militaries play within their governments, because many of these countries coming out of the Soviet system, the military and the security services played an outsized role in the governance of those countries. And so ensuring that their ministries of defense reform and they're budgeted in a way with transparency is also critical to democratic health. So I think NATO, the values at NATO's core, we need to keep them there. And NATO operationally, by serving as a magnet and incentivizing countries to maintain their democratic core values, will remain indispensable.
So I applaud focus on this. You know, yesterday was the 20th anniversary of the welcoming of the first 3 post-Cold War allies to the alliance, so Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Today, 20 years later, they're allies, right? And Poland and Hungary are among the worst in terms of slippage or backsliding on democratic values, which they signed up to when they joined the alliance. So going back to basics here and remembering what it takes to become a member of the alliance, and then quietly, diplomatically, with discretion, holding allies accountable, is really a very important, important initiative, both for the Secretary General, but ideally from the United States, because we would be doing so from a position of example, of good example. And I'm actually, as an American citizen, concerned today that we're not maybe as strong an example on these core principles as we have been in the past.
The alliance has been extremely effective in helping particularly transitioning countries to understand the value, importance of civilian control over the military, and that has been its most direct contribution to democratic principles. As an alliance, as members, we contribute to democratic principles that Doug and others have talked about, not necessarily through NATO, but more bilaterally. So when I think of NATO, I think of a military organization whose primary mission is putting lead downrange, but as part of its contributions, it helps governments more effectively do that by helping them institutionalize the culture and practices of civilian control of the military.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. I think this brings the hearing to an end. I want to thank our 4 excellent panelists, and you notice we had so much interest in it. So many people kept coming and leaving when they had to, but making sure that they come back. It really was, I think, one of the best panels we've had. I want to thank all 4 of you for doing that. I want to remind the committee that at 2 o'clock we have a meeting with King Abdullah of Jordan over in the Capitol. So I would hope that members of the committee would attend that. And again, I want to thank all witnesses, and the hearing is now adjourned.
Thank you.